The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 601 Assassination. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Point in the education hall. Seals screamed and bounced away when they saw Franz approaching. Several great orcs also made unpleasant alarm calls. Maria, who was still playing in the water, ran back to the classroom as fast as she could. Then she heard a rustling sound inside, and soon the noise turned into the sound of reading. Franz could only sigh helplessly. Through the window, he could see the disdainful eyes of his second brother. Maximilian seemed to have a lot of objections to his eldest brother. Ludwig still had a dumbbell in one hand and a book in the other as usual, but he didn't know whether he could understand what was written in the book. The other companions also acted very hard. After all, Franz should be checking the post at this time, and the former also knew that the latter would rule the country. No matter what he did, he had to do it, as long as he was still in Austria. Deal with him. In fact, Franz also hopes that these people can be smarter. After all, these guys' starting point is too high. Even Franz cannot guarantee that these people will not be in high positions in the future. But so far, Franz still hasn't found anything extraordinary about these people, but at the same time, the resources, connections, and vision they have are almost beyond the reach of ordinary people. Who is the most hated person in Vienna? Is it Mrs. Sophie, who has a tough attitude and demanding feudal etiquette? Is it Count Korolaf, who has taken corruption and bribery and controlled the interior department for decades? Is it Lord Summer, who claims to command 100,000 secret police force to monitor the people's every move? Or Prince Metternich, who is known as the first national thief in Austria's history? Or was it Ludwig von Renz, the university student who twice brought Austria into war? Neither. Baron Bruck, president of the Central Bank of the Austrian Empire, was probably the most assassinated and defamed man in the Austrian Empire. In 3 years in California, he encountered more than 100 gunman attacks. Although it was related to the local poor security and radical policies, it was really exaggerated. But what is even more exaggerated is that during the 3 years when Baron Bruck officially served as the governor of the central bank, he suffered 35 assassinations and attacks in Vienna, and the stack of articles criticizing him was 2 meters high. You must know that Vienna is the core of the Austrian Empire, and it can be regarded as the safest city in the entire empire. But even so, some people still took the risk of almost 100% death to assassinate and attack Baron Bruck. What kind of deep hatred could do this? In fact, among the members of the royal family, Mrs. Sophie is already at the top of the list with 7 assassinations. In second place is Archduke Albrecht, who has only 4 assassinations. In third place is Franz Joseph and his father Franz Joseph. Landskar had 3 wins in a recent attack. Baron Bruck had 21 of his entourage, 8 of whom were killed and 13 injured. The severity of the incident had reached the point where Franz could not bear it. The Baron's residence was less than 300 meters away from the Imperial Central Bank, and nearly 100 gunmen were stationed within such a short distance. What's even more outrageous is that the two sides fought for nearly 10 minutes, and the nearby police, gendarmes, and escorts affiliated with the central bank showed no response. June 5, 1845. Cloudy Point. Klaus is a very outstanding soldier with an amazing talent for shooting moving targets, so he was selected early and specially trained as a bodyguard. After 5 years of hard training, he was still not selected into the Royal Guards, but he still got a good job as the bodyguard of Baron Bruck. Although Klaus didn't know what the central bank and the governor of the central bank did, he knew that this must be a great man. After all, usually big shots only bring 2 to 4 bodyguards. And even the Imperial Prime Minister and the Interior Minister only have 8 bodyguards, and the adult in front of him actually has 20 full-time guards, which shows his importance. However, what he didn't know was that this gentleman had a company of guards when he was in California. Of course, this had something to do with the strong local folk customs. After all, the western part of North America was still a bit wilder. Klaus, don't be dazed. Remember what your responsibilities are. The person speaking was Captain Calvin. It is said that his experience is definitely considered a legend among the guards. After all, he has encountered more than 20 attacks in his life and still survived. Okay, Mr. Captain. It's just over 200 meters away. We'll be there during your coffee time. And this is Vienna. What about Vienna? Does anyone really dare to carry out an attack here? In fact, almost no one of these bodyguards in the school would dare to carry out assassinations in a bustling urban area or an important city like Vienna, because the cost is too high and local officials cannot sit idly by. Where do you think I encountered those 20-some attacks? I was just like you when I first came here, but I advise you to pay attention. After all, you only live once. Klaus still knocked on the special steel carriage of the carriage in disbelief. This thing weighs 1.5 tons and requires 4 horses to pull it. The bullets hit it without even a dent. It can block the explosion of a 1.5 kilogram grenade at close range. I doubt anyone will use these 4 centimeters unless they use a cannon. Thick steel plates can't be helped. However, being a talker, Klaus carefully inspected his weapons. 2 of the latest military revolvers, and a new air rifle point. Although the air rifle can only be used with a bottle on your back, and looks like a toy, in this era of close combat, this thing has unparalleled lethality point. There are only 4 air rifles, and the remaining ones are also 2 short and 1 long, but the rifles they are equipped with are all lever action rifles. The lever action rifle first originated in Italy, but it was not taken seriously. Because Franz requested the development of a breech loading gun, the Austrian army conveniently bought the patent directly. Then after a group of experts improved it, and the technological level of Austria at this time was much higher than that of Italy in 1820. A lever action rifle that could be used in actual combat was built. The advantages of this gun are obvious. It has a large number of ammunition, fast reloading speed, fast shooting speed, and the rifling is also very accurate. But the shortcomings are also obvious. That is, it is unstable, has poor power, has a high mechanical failure rate, and is difficult to shoot from a prone position, but it is very suitable for queuing and shooting tactics. It can be said that the guns designed by the Austrians are quite in line with the characteristics of the times. It seems that they are preparing to carry out the queuing and shooting to the end point. Back to the main story. When the time came, Baron Bruck boarded the carriage on time, and the team marched toward the Imperial Central Bank in a mighty manner. However, as soon as I went out, I encountered an unexpected thing. A carriage loaded with logs suddenly lost control. The huge logs broke free from the ropes and scattered everywhere. Chapter 602 Assassination. Captain Calvin immediately shouted all hands on alert, and was shot through the head with a bullet. In fact, when the carriage loaded with logs suddenly appeared, everyone was already in a fighting state. Because in theory such large trucks are not allowed to enter on this street. Even if some people want to make money, they will choose to come at night. After all, it is not easy to be discovered that way. And if you transport this wood during the day, you will easily be spotted by the police and gendarmes, and you will inevitably be exploited. Even if the police and gendarmes are dismissed, pedestrians on the 2 bustling streets in front and behind will be in big trouble. The sudden appearance of an obviously overloaded carriage was too sudden, and when the guard captain drew his pistol, the driver on the opposite side obviously panicked, which is why the carriage suddenly lost control. Otherwise, the logs would not have been scattered on the ground, but would have been thrown at Baron Bruck's carriage. Seeing that the plan had changed, the attacker was not hesitant and actually chose to shoot directly. The first shot was followed by successive shots, but the main targets were the coachman and horses. It's a pity that the attackers still used muzzle-loaded rifles, and even a skilled veteran would need more than 20 seconds to reload. The escort accompanying Baron Bruck immediately fired back with guns, killing several gunmen who did not hide in time. But at this time, another group of gunmen shot out from both sides of the street. They also used revolvers, and a fierce battle immediately broke out between the 2 sides. The attackers wanted to use their numerical advantage to end the battle quickly, but what they didn't expect was that just 4 air rifles suppressed the charge of dozens of people. The range of an air rifle is 150 meters, but in fact it cannot kill anyone beyond 50 meters. Even if it is shot at close range, it cannot penetrate a 3 mm 9mm steel plate point, but air rifles have unparalleled shooting speed and continuous shooting capabilities before the invention of submachine guns. 4 air rifles rain bullets on the rushing gunman at a speed of 2 rounds per second. In 15 seconds, 120 rounds of bullets directly knocked the 20 gunmen at the front to the ground. The remaining gunmen had never seen such fierce firepower, and they all retreated for a while. At this time, it was the lever rifle's turn to exert its power. The fierce and precise bullets kept reducing the number of attackers. Of course, there are also attackers who use the commanding heights to shoot cold arrows at the guards. But the attackers soon discovered the problem. Pistols and muzzle-loading guns had no advantage at all when shooting against lever-action rifles in particular. The revolver seems to only rely on ricochet and God to kill the opponent, while the lever-action rifle can accurately shoot at point at the same time. The attackers discovered a problem, that is, the expected situation of the guards not standing in front of the carriage to physically block the bullets occurred. Instead, everyone hid behind the carriage. What's even more outrageous is that the carriage was unscathed after being fired by dozens of rifle bullets and hundreds of pistol rounds. The leader of the attackers was also worried. Just hearing the sound of a flower pot breaking, all the gunmen rushed towards the carriage as if they were on fire. They thought the silent rapid weapon had been exhausted, but they miscalculated. The 4 air riflemen had changed their gas bottles just now, and bullets rained down again. But this time the attackers did not retreat and rushed towards the carriage despite huge casualties. The guards also knew that the last moment had arrived, so they dropped their spears and drew their revolvers to fight. The close combat shooting was very brutal. People on both sides fell down one after another. Soon the last guard and the last attacker who rushed up were shooting at each other and fell to the ground. At this time, nearly 100 corpses were lying on the street. In fact, there was still a team of attackers left. However, because the carriage was too strong, long-range shooting was ineffective, so they could only get close to the carriage to ensure that they killed the target. What the hell? How can these bastards be so good at fighting? They've been fighting for so long. It seems we can't escape either. One of the attackers said very reluctantly. Another attacker said expressionlessly, the buyer has paid enough hush money. Our task now is to confirm that the target is dead, and then the balance will be left to our families. Damn it. When the attacker walked near the carriage, he discovered that the entire carriage was made of forged and welded steel. While they were thinking about how to open this steel-cased bastard, Klaus overturned the stall beside him and used the air rifle again. As the gas in the high-pressure cylinder was exhausted, the last attacker also died in convulsions. Klaus drew his revolver and stood guard against the stall until the city defense troops arrived and lost consciousness. Looking at the corpses on the ground in the messy streets, they felt like they were on a battlefield. They had never seen such a brutal battle. 80% of the attackers were killed directly or bled to death, and the situation of the remaining ones was also very pessimistic. 8 of the guards died on the spot, 10 of the remaining 13 lost consciousness, and the other 3 also lost the ability to move. Baron Brook himself only hit his forehead on the steel plate and suffered some minor trauma and concussion. After interrogation, it was determined that the attack was planned by several large families. What's the purpose? Naturally, it is the position of central bank governor, because Brook blocks too many people's financial paths. Since Baron Brook was supported by Archduke Franz, those people naturally did not dare to do anything to the latter, so they could only find ways to deal with the former. So 100 gunmen were hired and decided to assassinate Baron Brook on the street in front of the central bank. But Franz knew that the matter was far from simple. Who has the ability to clear away all the nearby military police and police, while at the same time keeping the escorts affiliated with the central bank stationary. Just when Franz was about to investigate thoroughly, Count Zassel found the former and warned Franz not to continue the investigation. He knew that this was what his mother meant, so Franz immediately rushed back to Schönbrunn Palace to ask Mrs. Sophie face to face, "Mother, why is this? They took the initiative to provoke us. Do you want me to swallow their anger? The same was true for the previous assassination of my father. What are you thinking about, Mrs. Sophie?" Franz, I hope you can understand that this country does not belong to you before you ascend the throne point, and by sacrificing Brooke alone, you can get the support of many people. Franz asked angrily, is it necessary to use a financial expert who is loyal to the country to exchange for the support of a group of rubbish who only know how to scheming? Mrs. Sophie was not in a hurry. She seemed to have known that Franz would say this. Mr. Brooke is indeed a loyal man, but he is not irreplaceable. There is no shortage of people in the empire who are more capable and have better background than him. You are not the emperor yet. You need to win over those big families to support you, instead of going against them and forcing them to support your opponents and prevent you from ascending the throne. Mrs. Sophie's words confused Franz, who didn't know what other opponents he had. Could it be Maximilian? But that's too ridiculous. Just the edict and Salic law left by Franz II made Franz feel that he could not lose to Maximilian. In addition, if his brother is really so confused, although he will not commit parricide, he will still have to teach him a lesson. Chapter 603 Anger. Franz did not agree with what Mrs. Sophie said. If the country wants the central bank to run smoothly, there must be a talented or loyal person in charge. The reason why Mrs. Sophie had this idea was simply that she was blinded by the superficial turmoil in the Austrian Empire's economy at this time, and some people instigated her to think that such a person was of little use. In the past, when the Austrian Empire was in financial difficulty, everyone knew that the country could not survive without Baron Brooke, a dedicated financial advisor. Because there are billions in arrears and the economy is in decline, those Jews and bankers may eat the country alive if they don't have a big boss to control them. But at this time, due to Franz's series of reforms, Austria's economy was much stronger than in history. The prosperity of the economy coupled with the enrichment of the national treasury and the top level of the country expanded. Some people begin to feel that it is all their own fault, and at the same time they also have the illusion that no one can do it except themselves. On the other hand, when the cake gets bigger, many people want to be the one to share it. The irony is that just a dozen years ago this was a position that people avoided. Otherwise it would not have fallen into the hands of a young baron with no background. After all, the Austrian Empire at that time couldn't even pay its officials' salaries, and being a soldier with your head in your belt was just a living. And now, as the president of the Austrian Empire's central bank, he can make several millionaires just by leaving something between his fingers. Millionaires at that time can be understood as millionaires who are now worth hundreds of millions, with assets of about several hundred million. This is still the currency of Austria, and it will be even more exaggerated if converted into pounds. A slight policy inclination can bring a lot of companies on the verge of bankruptcy back to life, and a few steps can make the whole of Austria, and even the whole of Central Europe, shake. Franz didn't want the cake he made to be divided among these insects, and Mrs. Sophie obviously had a misunderstanding about the role of Baron Brooke. Mother, do you remember the miracle Dr. Bianchi I told you about? Mrs. Sophie thought for a while and said, it can't be cured. Wait to die. Farewell. Franz couldn't help but have black lines on his head. Mother, you have a problem with your focus. Let me say it again. There was once a very famous doctor named Bianchi in the Far East. Bianchi had two brothers who were far better than him in medical skills, but were not famous. So someone asked Bianchi why this was happening. Bianchi's answer was that his eldest brother treated the disease before it occurred. Since most people did not know that he could eliminate the cause of the disease in advance, he was not only unknown, but was often regarded as a liar. As for the second brother's treatment, he treats the disease at the beginning of the disease. Most people think that he can only treat minor illnesses, so everyone just thinks that the second brother is just a country doctor, similar to the Zillow I told you before. Bianchi did not have the skills of his elder and second brothers. Whenever he was treating a serious illness, most people would see Bianchi inserting needles into the meridians to let blood, applying medicine to the skin and other major operations. Therefore, they thought that his medical skills were superb and his reputation was famous all over the country. Similar to the Elio Sandeo I told you. Elio Sandeo refers to Robert Liston, a pioneer in surgery who once completed 3 kills in one operation. It is said that Robert Liston cut off one of the assistant's fingers when cutting off the patient's thigh because his hand speed was too fast. Both of them died of postoperative infection soon after. In the end, even the saw was in violent motion. The iron bar broke and flew out, killing another lucky spectator. Mrs. Sophie was lost in thought, and then she spoke after a long time. "You mean that Baron Brooke may have a great role, Franz?" "Yes. With such a person here, those monsters and monsters will not dare to mess around. Do you still remember the opportunity to establish the Austrian Overseas Development Company, Mrs. Sophie? Isn't it that time you used bankers and big families to amass the country's wealth, Franz?" "No, mother. That's just the result. I only left Vienna for a few months, and when I came back, those monsters and monsters made huge waves. If I couldn't persuade them at that time point, now the entire Austrian Empire has to work for them, and all the previous reform achievements will be in vain. So we need to have such trustworthy and capable people in charge. Are you planning to travel to sea again?" Mrs. Sophie asked with some confusion. Franz was very speechless, but to be honest, he really had this plan before. But he was afraid after the last crisis. In fact, if Baron Brooke had not been in California, but in Vienna at that time, even if he didn't know what those bankers were doing, he would have been able to stop it in time, as long as he found that the limelight was not right. At least they can wait until Franz comes back instead of making a lot of loophole-filled operations to allow the opponent to find opportunities to further expand the results. "No, mother. But you should know that you raised me to be an emperor, not a financier, don't you, Franz?" Used Madame Sophie's words to refute her. The latter naturally had nothing to say, but would pinch the former's ears to show her anger. "It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. You, kid, you have your own ideas, and I will fully support you. But I must remind you that you are not the emperor yet, and those old nobles you look down on actually still have huge energy." Mrs. Sophie said meaningfully. To be honest, she was very happy because Franz was more outstanding than she expected. However, as a mother and a woman who knew the horrors of palace politics, she must tell her son not to ignore those who are easy to ignore opponent. "I don't look down on them. On the contrary, I have been relying on them, and I even hope that they can keep up with the rhythm of the new era. But this time those old guys have gone too far, and I must let them know who is the master of this country." Franz is very confident. He feels that his reforms have achieved initial results, and he has a lot of chips in his hands at the same time. This is a case that happened in Vienna. The evidence is conclusive. It won't kill many people, but it can at least bring down a large number of people who are dissatisfied with themselves. As for the old aristocrats and nobles, Franz has been extremely benevolent. He issued additional shares many times for them to buy, gave them priority in selling fertilizers, new agricultural tools and improved methods, and opened up official positions in the colony to them. He hoped that these people could follow suit, keep pace with the times. But look what these guys have done. Don't want to work hard, don't want to change, just want to share the cake. Franz, those old guys you mentioned have already approached me. They will give you the list of the masterminds and collaborators involved in planning this incident, as well as the specific participants. A total of 261 people. Franz was startled by Mrs. Sophie's words, but then asked, "What do they want?" 6 people will be sentenced to hang, and the rest will be exiled. In fact, hanging 6 people was in line with the Austrian style. After all, the Habsburg family had a good reputation for mercy. Where will they be exiled? Paris, London, New York, maybe in Berlin or St. Petersburg. What's the difference between that and traveling? How do you want to do it, Congo? Otherwise I guarantee they won't leave Vienna alive. Chapter 604 Competitor, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was in a bad mood and had just left Madame Sophie's bedroom. The former just learned from the latter that the so-called competitors were not his 2 brothers, but his father, Archduke Franz Karol. In fact, because the ancient Silesian Archduke Franz Karol was the first heir to the throne of the Austrian Empire, there were very few people who knew the late emperor's decree. In addition, it is still unknown how effective a dead man's edict is, and those who know the late emperor's edict and have the ability to carry out its contents are all older. Archduke Karol, Archduke Louis, and Prince Metternich are all in their twilight years. At this time, most people in Vienna did not think that Franz could succeed to the throne soon, because although Ferdinand I was plagued by all kinds of diseases, he did not have the kind of fatal disease, so he could not live for another 10 or 20 years. Historically, Ferdinand I lived for 27 years after abdicating the throne, and did not die until June 29, 1875. Franz's father, Archduke Franz Karl, was in good health, loved nature, and was good at hunting. He could climb stairs with a seal weighing 60 to 70 kilograms, and his physical fitness could beat his peers. It will take nearly 30 years for these two to pass away. By that time, it is not certain whether Franz Joseph will still be alive. After all, there is no shortage of surprises in this era. Moreover, the old guys in Vienna all know that people can change. Even Emperor Joseph II, who was the least adaptable, ended up ruining his own reforms with his own hands. 30 years is enough time to corrupt anyone, even a born saint, as Archbishop Prussia calls him. In fact, if he was born in a peaceful and prosperous age, Franz might really choose to join the trend. After all, any change is a challenge to those with vested interests, and even if you live a life of debauchery and extravagance, the lucky draw of this reincarnation is enough to cope with it. Even if you play a little too much, someone will wash the floor for you. Unless you commit suicide, no one can do anything to you. But the reality is that in 1848, the entire Austrian Empire will fall into a huge crisis. If you make a mistake, you may be guillotined like Louis XVI, and you will be nailed to the throne forever, on the pillar of shame. Therefore, Franz will become the emperor of the Austrian Empire in 1848, and at the same time, declare war on the old era. Anyone who stands in his way will be swept into the garbage dump of history. In fact, in addition to Archduke Franz Karl, those people also vaguely revealed it to Madame Sophie. We don't want to see what happened in Russia happen in Austria. What those people meant was that they could also choose to help Queen Anna ascend to the throne, and the Habsburg family was not the only choice. Fortunately, Mrs. Sophie was not a person who would be easily threatened. The gentleman who said this had already been punished at the bottom of the Danube River. Subsequent investigation results showed that only 252 of the 261 people on the list had been punished, and the whereabouts of 9 people were unknown, or they had committed suicide inexplicably, and their bodies could not be identified. It just so happens that Franz is not a person who likes to be threatened, let alone a person who likes to be deceived. As a result, several groups of thugs broke into the homes of several officials at night and committed murders. One aristocratic family that had been in business for hundreds of years was bombed into the sky along with its mansion. In addition, there were several accidents in the Austrian Empire. Some people were hit by carriages, some people unfortunately fell into pig pens and drowned alive in pig fesses, and some people stuck their heads out while riding on the train. Unfortunately, the window was shattered into pieces by another oncoming train. Another person unfortunately fell into the water on a ship bound for the United States and was caught in the propeller at the stern of the ship and died. The people who had the accident happened to be those who were missing or dead on the list. Even the police and judges could only lament that the world is so big and full of wonders. God has eyes. Although Vienna has been uneasy recently, there have been no civilian casualties. However, Vienna's police chief was still to blame, and the old chief had to retire early. However, when the old director was about to leave the city in a carriage, he collided with a carriage loaded with logs, and a large number of logs buried the former inside. The bizarre incident did not subside until a month later, and the 6 culprits who participated in creating a series of terrorist incidents in Vienna were brought to justice on that day. Strangely enough, after that day Vienna returned to its former peace. In Schönbrunn Palace, the seals snorted at the sun boredly, occasionally patting their round bellies, and the great hawks made unpleasant sounds. As for Empress Anna, who was shivering in the Hofburg Palace at this time, she didn't know why those people came to find her, but she knew very well that if she did anything out of line, she might be blown to pieces or die. Some kind of accident. In addition, approximately 150 police officers, 50 military police, and 150 central bank guards were assigned to serve in the California mines on charges of malfeasance. Franz sympathized with these people, but would not let them go. When soldiers and police help others commit crimes, they are no longer different from murder, as the German region was very sensitive to the wind direction in Vienna, and they knew very well that a strong monarch would appear in Austria in the future point, but that will have to wait until 20 years later, so people of their generation don't have to worry at all points due to its direct border with the Austrian Empire. The Germans Wolverine greatly promoted Saxony's economic development point, although they knew very well that they could not defeat the powerful Austria and Prussia. This did not hinder these man-made wonders. In addition to building a new steeple cathedral, the Saxons who had money also planned to renovate the Dresden Palace Point. In addition, King Frederick August II also discovered another way to immortalize himself, and that was to create Great Music Point, but he soon discovered that the appeal of Dresden was incomparable to Vienna, and it was simply impossible to overpower Austria in this regard. Point as for the artistic desert of Berlin, there was no need to suppress it at all, and then Frederick August II found a new goal point, that was to create the best instruments in the world, and he considered the piano to be the most important of them all. Point however, many people in the German region had similar ideas to Frederick August II. In fact, due to the German customs union driving the economic development of the German region, people began to pursue spiritual enjoyment more and more. Point historically, a large number of piano factories appeared in Germany around 1850, and in one fell swoop it established its position as the world's #1 high-end piano producer. However, facing the vigorous piano making movement in Germany, Franz seemed a little at a loss. After all, he had only touched the piano in school and had no idea about its structure and key points. However, Austria is quite rich in pianists. Chapter 605 Riding the Wind and Waves. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. At the turn of spring and summer, the royal gardens seemed a bit sultry. This kind of weather made Franz feel irritable, and the damp sense of ritual made him feel even more aggravated. Point it was obviously against the rules to conduct such an above-board conspiracy in such a beautiful place, even though they were discussing important strategic decisions. But there is one thing to say, although he is already a frequent visitor to this place, he still can't help but linger. The scenery here is really charming, completely in line with the feeling of climbing up and looking far away. There are no floating clouds, but beautiful royal buildings, royal gardens and beautiful artificial lakes. Wait, what is that? Something was coming over the waves. At this moment, a seal as fat as a torpedo was dragging Friedrich rushing through the artificial lake. Point just 5 minutes ago the young Archduke realized that he seemed to be running late. Point, so he decided to take a shortcut, and after climbing up an tree wall, he jumped down. But his leap of faith was ruined by a branch hanging from his trousers. Although Friedrich tried his best to swing his arms, he had no wings after all, and finally fell straight down. After the smoke and dust passed, he found that he was not injured and could feel the soft and waxy Q-bomb on his hand. Point Friedrich suddenly became excited. He still remembered that Franz once told a story about a young prince who met a beautiful princess. It's just that the princess climbed over the wall and knocked down the prince, but she was just the opposite. Point. While Friedrich fantasized about the other person's appearance at the moment, he was also a little troubled that he was about to get married. Is this behavior considered unfaithful to his fiancée? After a battle between heaven and man, Friedrich finally opened his eyes. He found a pair of big black moist eyes staring at him. Point only it was not a princess, but a huge seal. The frightened Friedrich was about to get up and escape when the angry sea beast bit his trousers. He only had one thought in his mind at this time: why wasn't this damn rag torn? However, the quality of military products has been tested by practice at this moment. Seeing that he could not pull out his feet, the young Grand Duke had another plan in mind, preparing to lift the seal in front of him with both hands and throw it out. Point after all, he had witnessed Franz's father being able to pick it up with one arm. Presumably this thing should be as puffy as a balloon, and not too heavy. Point the idea is beautiful, but the reality is very ugly. The little giant, who was only 1.6 meters tall, could not even hold the giant beast's waist, but he accidentally touched the seal's itchy flesh. Point the result was that, because of the stimulation, it wanted to speed away from here, and the young Archduke, who was also frightened, subconsciously pressed his whole body tightly against the seal. Point then a seal carried a man on its back and began to rush forward in the palace garden. Along the way, it passed through the trees, pressed over the flowers and plants, and knocked over several pieces of exquisite porcelain. A team of maids delivering food were still joking, but they suddenly heard some strange noises. When everyone was confused, one person and one leopard rushed out of the bushes, rushed into the crowd like bowling balls, and knocked down all the maids. Drinks were flying all over the sky. The moving seal also grabbed a fish in its mouth, and then sucked it in. Although Friedrich's trousers were loosened, he couldn't notice them as he was already in such a mess along the way. Finally, one person and one leopard rushed out of the garden, rushed to the pier, jumped into the air, and then landed heavily on the water. Before the water calmed down again, the seal sprinted again, one person and one leopard chopping through the waves in the artificial lake. Although the scene of the leopard charging was very satisfying, Friedrich as the passenger was not happy at all. Soon he couldn't hold on and fell, but what was even worse was that his legs actually cramped. I'm the Marshal of the Navy. How could I die in the sea? Damn it. I can't float. No wonder Franz always keeps himself away from the water. He is really hated by the sea. The lack of oxygen to the brain in the water made Friedrich gradually lose consciousness. Before losing consciousness, he saw a figure swimming towards him. Half an hour later, Franz. Mr. Sintepner, how is he? The Grand Duke is fine. He just drank some water and swallowed a fish. He may have indigestion. Thank you, doctor. Please go this way. Franz was speechless for a while. Friedrich seemed really not suitable for playing with water. Ahem. Friedrich coughed up another large amount of water and then woke up. Franz, yes, uncle, I'm here. How did you fall into the water? Friedrich gasped hard. There was a seal. It dragged me in. Who would have thought it was so heavy? After hearing the cause and effect, Franz was even more speechless. The seal my father held only weighed about 60 kilograms, and the one you tried to lift weighed at least 150 kilograms. Even my father knew that persimmons should be picked when they are soft. It is obvious that your challenge has exceeded the level. Friedrich rolled his eyes at Franz and then changed the subject. Okay, let's not talk about it anymore. Why do you want to come to me? Do you remember that little island in the Pacific that I described to you? Hawaii. Isn't that a British place? On February 10th, 1843, the Royal Navy battleship HMS Callista Ford arrived in Honolulu. British merchants Richard Charlton and Alexander Simpson claimed that British people and their property were being treated unfairly on Hawaii Island. So the British commander George Paulet made a series of demands to the then King of Hawaii, Kamehameha III, and threatened that he would immediately launch an attack if the British's legitimate rights and interests were not met. In fact, similar things have happened before. The Americans and the French have used similar reasons to blackmail this kingdom surrounded by oceans, but the former extorted only money, while Britain's target was the entire Hawaiian Islands. Although Kamehameha III wanted to fight hard, after all, he had hundreds of thousands of subjects and thousands of warriors, but these natives, who were only equipped with spears, daggers, axes and some old-fashioned flintlocks, were unable to fight against the British long guns and short cannons. Although George Paulet actually had only about 300 Marines and 500 Navy soldiers, but just a simple contact with 100 of the bravest warriors in the Hawaiian army destroyed most of them, while only one British recruit was burned by the gunpowder gas of his own rifle. In the end, Kamehameha III had no choice but to surrender. And finally, on February 25, 1843, the Kingdom of Hawaii and the United Kingdom signed a temporary cession agreement for the islands. Afterwards, the British established a committee on the Hawaiian Islands and began to rule the islands in a high-pressure manner. They began to occupy ports, drive away merchants from other countries, erase the traces of the Hawaiian kingdom, support puppets, and even established a puppet army composed of Hawaiians. However, the British's behavior of eating alone was quickly protested by French and American businessmen. The French even sent a fleet to reason with the British. So the British soon restored the independence of the Kingdom of Hawaii, but in fact they still firmly held the position of emperor. It has to be said that the strategic vision of the British Empire was indeed unique. This island country located deep in the Pacific Ocean did become the strategic core of the Americans' control of the Asia-Pacific region in the future, and one of its places was also occupied by an aircraft from another island country nearly 100 years later. Patronize point. Although there are three forces on Hawaii Island, Britain, France, and the United States, Britain and France obviously did not ask the opinions of the Americans when they carved up the islands, and they did not intend to let the latter join the party. An American businessman on the island of Hawaii wrote to James Knox Polk, the US president at this time, hoping that the most powerful president in US history would send a fleet to threaten Britain and France like the French, thereby protecting the United States businessman's interests. But toughness does not mean being stubborn. Especially after being tricked by the British once, before at Land Rock, Polk began to re-examine himself and the United States, which seemed not as perfect as he imagined. The US government rejected the businessman's request, so the businessman named Thomas Faneuil instead wrote to the Austrian Imperial government, claiming that his ancestors were subjects of the Holy Roman Empire. Austrian senior officials have little interest in this kind of operation that spans half the world. After all, the output of those small islands may not be enough for transportation expenses, but Franz is quite interested in this, and he has other purposes, which is to knock on Japan's door. After all, Austria wants to develop California and Nevada, and the current manpower alone is far from enough. Moreover, Japan's financial system is also very chaotic at this time, but it can still make a lot of money, and it is even possible to take advantage of the loopholes to control its financial system in one fell swoop. In fact, Franz still brought some private goods, such as some music in Schönbrunn Palace. Friedrich expressed his inability to understand Franz's strategy, because Japan at this time was still very mysterious to Westerners. Although Austria has a large amount of intelligence provided by the Dutch, it still does not know much about its internal structure, military strength, and resource allocation. Friedrich, my navy has launched another new ship. This time it's time to give it a try. Franz, you can try, but I don't think I can fight. Friedrich, I'm not talking about the British and French. How can such a big Japan sit down and talk with us if they don't fight a few wars? Franz, negotiations don't need to be done alone. Friedrich looked at Franz with some confusion, and the latter snapped his fingers. Kagura put on the Miko costume again, but the feeling was completely different from before. Don't you say that Japan is a patriarchal society? Are you sure this little girl won't be quartered? Franz, that depends on whether you have enough deterrence. Friedrich sighed. I don't know what you are planning, but I must tell you that Britain and France have made many small moves at sea. If we all go out like before, if anything happens, the previous US-Mexican War is the best example. In fact, because the main force of the Austrian Imperial Navy went to the east and failed to return in time, France had few choices during the Mexican-American War, leaving the Austrian side strategically passive, especially in the direction of California, which was almost lost. If the Austrian Imperial Navy had been there at that time, I'm afraid that the US military would not have dared to attack California at all. Even if there is a fierce battle between the two sides, the former will have a high probability of sending the latter to the bottom of the sea. Franz, so this time you will only take 10 ships. Friedrich, 10 ships? Are you kidding me? Didn't you say that country has a population of at least 30 million and an army of 500,000? Are you going to let me use 10 ships to attack France? France, don't worry, that country has many islands and mountains, and the local separatist forces are very strong. The shogunate only has 200,000 troops, and they can only mobilize 100,000 at most, and this will take at least half a year, so you are completely don't worry. Friedrich, do they have artillery? Franz, yes. Friedrich, you are committing murder. Those toy soldiers of yours just killed 5,000 British troops on the island of Kalimantan. Franz, reminded, that's the British Indian Army. Friedrich was speechless. Indians not British. It doesn't count. Why? If you don't believe it, ask the British. Friedrich was speechless again. When he went to India before, the British really said this. Just think of them as indigenous Africans. Franz comforted, and Friedrich immediately retorted, it only takes a few incendiary bombs to deal with those African natives, and then wait for the fire to recede to identify the bodies. Can the same be done to deal with the shogunate? It's really good. The vast majority of houses in Japan are wooden buildings, and their layout is extremely unreasonable, with dense buildings, narrow roads, and extremely poor fire resistance. In addition, there is no advanced firefighting equipment, and the burning may be worse than the dry season on the African grasslands. It's just that fire attacks damage your moral character, so you'd better do it less. In fact, there have been many super fires in Japanese history, and there have even been city-destroying disasters like the Edo fire. A fire directly burned 2/3 of the buildings in Edo Castle at that time, and the number of direct victims was as high as 100,000. What is a comparative chart of killings by Eastern gods? Friedrich was confused, but he was still looking forward to this trip. After all, it was his first time to sail around the world. The route Franz mapped out was to start in Austria, go around South America to California, then set off for Hawaii and finally Japan. Okay. Then, I have one more question. Say, the sea is not suitable for women, or is this Miss Kagura ready to dedicate her life to the Navy? Don't worry about this, I have a way. As long as you put her in the same room as your fiancé. Sneaker. Yeah, it's really annoying. It's not you. You actually put my fiancé and Carolina together. How could I know? Thanks to you being regarded as a saint by the Archbishop, you don't even know that my sister is the most spendthrift among the ladies in Vienna. How would I know? I just think it might be inconvenient for her to live as a girl in Schönbrunn Palace, so I sent her back to your home. After all, Princess Sneaker will be your wife sooner or later, and it is completely reasonable for her to live with your sister. Damn it, my salary and annuity combined are not enough for her. Isn't your family famous for spending money excessively? Why are you still worrying about this little money? Who said our family spends money excessively? We are just never stingy with the money we should spend. Then, how did Aunt Carolina develop her habit of spending money excessively? Friedrich said somewhat helplessly. Hey, my father thinks girls are born to spend money. Okay, I'll help you solve the money problem. It's better for you to keep her with you as your wife. She should also adapt to your life. Besides, I think it's quite romantic to treat this round the world trip as your own wedding. Chapter 606 Quarrel. On the island of Ireland, the rain poured down, but for some reason almost all the islanders did not feel refreshed, but instead felt heavy and oppressed. The strange germs that appeared a few years ago, the priests who suddenly went crazy, the prophecies that were spread more and more mysteriously, and the abnormal weather all cast a shadow on the hearts of the farmers. As an experienced farmer, Patrick's father had a very strong feeling that there would be no good harvest this year. Although it was ridiculous, he secretly replaced the potatoes with wheat and barley without telling his wife and children. A week later, Patrick brought back a newspaper from the town, which said that potatoes were growing well throughout the European continent, and Ireland was no exception. In fact, the British government is trying its best to conceal what happened in Belgium and the Netherlands. Potatoes in the entire Walloon region almost all died within a week. And this terrible situation is spreading to the European continent. Potato late blight has appeared in parts of France and Germany, and Spain and Portugal have not been spared. But at this time, the British government blocked the news in the country. The reason is that this curse-like germ also appeared on the island of Great Britain. Scotland on the island of Great Britain is the hardest hit area, with more than half of the potato crop dead, and large tracts of farmland in Wales and England also dead. At this time, there have been no large-scale disasters on the island of Ireland, but unlike the UK, the main source of food for people here is potatoes. Once there is a problem with potatoes, it will be a devastating disaster. Under the propaganda of good news announcements from the British government, the Irish people gradually indulged in the illusion of a good harvest. Little do we know that the pace of disaster never stops in the countryside of Southern Ireland. The Jennings family still leads a busy and peaceful life. Scathach always complained that her parents gave her too much work. But as the eldest girl in the family, she not only had to do farm work outside, but also had to do housework and take care of the baby when she came home. So she began to imagine that she could become the youngest one, or become a boy. After all, Patrick is either wandering around or attending so-called drinking parties every day. As long as he doesn't miss dinner, his parents will be extremely tolerant of him. Patrick can also bring friends home. Wine has been living and dining at Jennings' house for a long time, and he is always staring at Scathach. This made her feel very unhappy, because she couldn't even adopt a stray cat, but her eldest brother could keep a person at home. To be honest, Scathach thought those barley cakes and barley hemispheres tasted pretty good. After all, after eating potatoes for more than 10 years, it was okay to change the taste occasionally. But there is a big problem, that is, the yield of barley is still too low. I'm afraid that even the rations for the winter will be a problem, let alone enough money to pay rent to the gentleman. Maybe we can borrow some money from the church to tide over this crisis. After all, the priests seem very wealthy and friendly. Scathach thought this, and then heard Patrick and Wine openly plotting about Ireland's future on the haystack. They planned to overthrow the British rule, then bring back the exiled and enslaved people and grant them freedom again. The two thought that on the island of Ireland, where there were no British people, they could freely enter the farmland to harvest wheat and send it to the mill. At that time, someone would grind the wheat for them for free and bake sweet and soft white bread for them. Until then they can sprinkle salt, sugar and pepper on the bread. But in Scathach's eyes, this is simply nonsense. After all, if no one grows food, how can crops grow in the ground? And since everyone is Irish, even if the British are driven away, potatoes should still be grown in the fields also. As a senior gourmet, Scathach stole the salt, pepper, and sugar from the church. The taste of these three things mixed together was really not good. On the other hand, Scathach felt that his parents were not exiled to the other side of the world, Australia, by the British. There was no need for Patrick to hate the British so much, let alone get himself into trouble. She feels that, although she is ruled by the British now, her life is not too bad. Scathach still envied Patrick. He was obviously older than himself, but he didn't have to do much farm work. He could just lie on the haystack and daydream every day. It was pity that he had to collect straw everywhere for emergencies. But one day Patrick was overheard by Scathach's father when he and Wine were conceiving their grand plan. I don't welcome any lad talking about this illegal stuff in my home. This is a very stern warning. Most of the farmers in Ireland are honest and conscientious people. Once they start to accuse, it proves that they have reached an intolerable level. Mr. Jennings, I appreciate your hospitality these days, but your tyranny cannot kill my freedom. Long live Ireland. Even if you support British rule, you are the object of our liberation. Cheers to our future. This was the first thing Wine said to Mr. Jennings in so many days. He was so unruly and left with his head held high. But Mr. Jennings's eyes were also very firm. He didn't think what he did was wrong. He had seen too many people like this, but Ireland was always British land, and as a father, a husband himself had to protect his family from harm. Dad, what have you done? Wine is a true Irishman. Before Patrick could finish his words, he was slapped hard by his father. You are not allowed to associate with such dangerous people, and you are not allowed to attend drinking parties from now on. You are already obsessed with it. Do you understand? You are the one who is obsessed with me, the Englishman's lackey. After saying this, Patrick was about to leave, but his father grabbed his arm. If you leave, don't come back. If you don't come back, you won't come back. Patrick shook off his father's hand and strode away. This was the first time that Scathach saw his father and his eldest brother having such a tense argument. He wanted to step forward to stop him, but suddenly lost his courage and just stood there blankly. Their point for a long time, his father fell weakly to the ground, as if his soul had been drained out. Scathach wanted to step forward to comfort him, but he didn't know what to say. In the end, my father plucked up the courage to return to the fields and continue farming before Scathach did. He cleaned up the weeds in the fields as usual, but he worked extra hard. In exchange for telling stories to Mickey and Tommy for 10 nights, Scathach got the two little guys treasured field mice. She mixed the two big field mice with potatoes, crumbs, and wild vegetables into a pot of porridge. When Scathach came to the field with hot porridge, his father was already sweating profusely. When the latter saw the former, he still forced a smile, but Scathach cried. In the end, the father and daughter held each other's hands and cried. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 607, Foot Washing Tax. Oh my god. Oh god. What a terrible disaster. It's a curse. The end. A scream woke up Scathach, who was still sleeping. Sister is not good. Mickey and Tommy said in tears. Scathach asked with concern, what happened? It's potatoes. They were fine yesterday, but today the potatoes that were growing well all turned rotten and smelly overnight. My father dug out the potatoes from the ground, but they fell apart like cow dung. Oh god. Although she had anticipated this possibility before, she almost fainted when she heard that all the potatoes that her family relied on for survival in previous years were spoiled. Immediately, Scathach began to vomit violently. In fact, when people are extremely frightened, it is easy to cause stomach cramps and even vomiting. When they came to the field, they found that it was already full of people. There were people beating their chests and cursing, as well as the crying of women and children. There was no sound other than that. Even the wisest and most knowledgeable elders in the village were helpless in the face of this situation. Those potatoes that were growing happily before seemed to wither overnight. Some people reluctantly tore off the withered leaves in an attempt to isolate the curse with broken branches. But past experience is of no use. Once one leaf begins to wilt, the same thing will happen to other leaves within a few days, until the crop dies completely. Despair and death enveloped the entire island of Ireland. In fact, it was the previous rain that brought the potato late blight bacteria to the island of Ireland, spreading the bacteria through water vapor circulation. On the other hand, potato late blight also appeared in Franz's experimental fields on the island of Ireland, but Bordeaux mixture still had a certain effect, and some potatoes were not infected with this terrible bacteria. However, these potatoes cannot solve the food ration problem for the 8 million people on the island of Ireland, and it is not easy to transport large amounts of anhydrous copper sulfate and quicklime to the island of Ireland. Bordeaux mixture is a sky blue colloidal suspension prepared from about 500 grams of copper sulfate, 500 grams of slaked lime and 50 kilograms of water. Fortunately for the problem of quicklime, it can be calcined using the ancient method, but anhydrous copper sulfate cannot be produced with Ireland's industrial capacity. Importing from Austria requires a lot of freight, and the British also have to pay a large tariff. As for buying directly from the British, the cost will be even greater, because Austria's chemical product production capacity at this time is far higher than the former. At the same time, doing so is no different from capitalizing on the enemy. Although France spent a lot of money to purchase the materials, in the end the British can definitely claim it as their own credit. After all, the raw materials come from Great Britain. In fact, when the British government saw that the incident was exposed, it had already begun to blame it. Since the British had not established germ theory at that time, the British could not give a reasonable explanation. According to the authoritative guess of the Royal Society of Science at the time, the potato withering phenomenon occurring at this time was because the potatoes were infected with farmers' athlete's foot. What's even more outrageous is that this statement was unanimously recognized by Queen Victoria in the British Parliament. They felt that the best way to avoid this situation was that colonial people should wash their feet more often. At that time Ireland was under the administration of the Colonial Office, so British officials introduced a foot washing tax overnight, stipulating that Irish people must pay a certain amount of fines if they do not wash their feet and cause potatoes to wither. The original intention of this law was to solve the potato blight problem on the island of Ireland, but it completely backfired and the colony's officials took advantage of their power and this special decree to start making money crazily. After all, if you expect a group of guys who can't even afford shoes to wash their feet, it's just nonsense. Soon uprisings broke out in Ireland against this decree, because there was another sport in Ireland at this time. That was the second enclosure movement, but this time the people who ate people on the surface changed from sheep to cows and wheat. The previous document mentioned that due to the Corn Laws and the development of the British economy, The livestock industry in Ireland became prosperous again. However, the second enclosure movement was hindered by the struggles of O'Connell and Irish farmers. However, as the prices of livestock products continued to increase, coupled with the promulgation of the foot washing tax, British landowners found a breaking point and drove farmers off their land. Those who couldn't survive would naturally rebel. Normally, the British government would choose to suppress it forcefully. But at this time, Robert Peel was already overwhelmed by international affairs, and with the Whigs stirring up trouble, he didn't want a fire in his backyard. At the same time, Prince Albert also discovered through visits that the situation in Ireland was completely different from what the colonial secretary said. At least this foot washing tax didn't help. As a result, Irish farmers regained their land, but a massive reduction in potato production was unavoidable. At this time, these farmers either give up the land they depend on for survival, or borrow usury from the landlords. But both ultimately lead to the same result. In fact, in order to prevent the further spread of blight, many farmers choose to forcibly dig out potatoes that are not yet fully mature to reduce losses. It looks like a lot of people won't make it through this winter, Scathach's father said, and Scathach nodded heavily. After all, she had seen it last winter. There are several families missing in the village. Although the priests said that they went to other countries, isn't the kingdom of heaven another country? At least the kingdom of heaven shouldn't be in a place like England. Scathach believed. Finally, the first healthy and complete potato was dug out. It seemed that God still favored Ireland and did not let all the potatoes turn into paste. Potatoes infected with potato late blight will turn to mush. Scathach's father was also very excited and said to her quickly, "Try it." The latter took the potato thrown by the former and wiped it vigorously with the corner of his skirt and then took a bite. It was crispy and delicious, but not rotten inside. If the inside is rotten, you can only throw it away. After all, if you eat too many rotten potatoes, even a pig will die. It's delicious. Scathach's eyes narrowed into a thin line. That's good. Her father also laughed. In fact, potatoes are not suitable for eating raw, especially the varieties grown in Ireland at this time. But people at that time were not so particular than the shovel touched the ground again, slowly digging into it, lifting up the blackened soil. Scathach couldn't help but hold her breath before the potato roots were exposed. She was a little afraid that she would see that the potatoes had turned into a mess, but fortunately that did not happen. However, not everyone is so lucky. Some people don't even have a whole potato in their fields. Their fate can be imagined. After completing this early harvest, the Jennings family returned to their home and looked at the bags of harvest, but were not happy at all. The rumor of a bad potato harvest is unfounded. The Times. Chapter 608. The Key to the Future. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz felt that Bordeaux liquid was in a very embarrassing situation at this time. Yes, it can prevent potato late blight to some extent. But first of all, the best way to use Bordeaux mixture is to prevent it from being spilled in advance, rather than treating it after it occurs, which greatly increases the dosage and waste. The second problem is that the output of anhydrous copper sulfate in the Austrian Empire is seriously insufficient. In fact, Austrians usually mine gall vitriol and use it to smelt copper, or make anhydrous copper sulfate. Franz knew that industrialization would definitely not be the same processing method as in this small workshop. At that time, the ancient method of calcination was mainly used for low efficiency and high losses. Just when Franz was about to mobilize experts from the Royal Academy of Sciences to develop a new method, he learned that the original method for industrial production of anhydrous copper sulfate had been invented as early as 1838, but there was no previous demand for it from Austria. Introduction. So Franz bought this technology from the Swedes for £2,000. This was not because the former was bargaining hard, but because this technology did not attract people's attention after it came out, and naturally it would not be too high price. The problem of preparing anhydrous copper sulfate was finally solved, but new problems soon arose. Although potato late blight has not yet appeared in the Austrian Empire at this time, it is possible that it has appeared, but was not reported in time. But should we prevent it in advance, if the use of Bordeaux mixture to prevent potato late blight was promoted throughout the Austrian Empire, the consumption would be staggering. In addition, the biggest problem is how to deliver the raw materials of Bordeaux liquid to the island of Ireland. Due to the existence of the German Customs Union and the Apennine Customs Union, the trade links between Austria and the United Kingdom are not strong. Coupled with the trade protection policies pursued by various countries at this time, goods from the Austrian Empire had to pay huge tariffs to enter the UK. This problem has prevented Austria's leading products such as sewing machines, rubber products, medicines, bicycles, etc. from occupying the British market. At the same time, due to high patent fees and a lack of raw materials, British factories are unwilling to produce these things, so these things that are bad street in Austria are still scarce in Great Britain. Although the British hold the banner of free economy all day long and claim that they must not do anything to interfere with freedom, in fact they have not slacked off at all when it comes to import tariffs. Historically, Robert Peel advocated free trade and actually reduced British tariffs, but there was a premise at that time, that is, Great Britain's industry was invincible. Was Robert Peel's purpose to let the people of the world enjoy the fruits of the British Industrial Revolution? Of course not. He wanted to use Britain's cheap industrial products to destroy the industrial buds of any potential competitors. This is a very powerful conspiracy to attack Europe and the world openly with cheap industrial products, turning all competitors into its raw material suppliers. In this way, the strong competitiveness of British industrial products can be maintained, and people in the future can use this advantage to fight a bloodless war. This is why Robert Peel was called the chief architect of the Victorian era by later politicians, because this conspiracy was indeed inevitable. But the present is different from history. The Austrian Empire's overtaking in some technological corners caught the British off guard, and the successive rises of the Apennine Customs Union, the German Customs Union, and the Franco-Spanish Customs Union made them feel sick. Therefore, Robert Peel did not dare to promote free trade at this time, and could only increase tariffs on goods from the Austrian Empire. This situation is usually not a big deal for Austria. And it is even a little refreshing, because it can use this excuse to increase tariffs on British goods, so that the former's position in the German Customs Union will be more stable. But at this time, the situation was reversed. Franz ran into trouble when he wanted to deliver goods to Britain, even for the life-saving supplies for the British. In normal times, Franz could have bribed one or two customs officials to solve the problem, but due to the previous assassinations of British officials and celebrities by radicals, customs inspections had become unprecedentedly strict. The plot of Victoria's visit to France in the previous book. In addition, in order to ensure that nothing happened on the island of Ireland, the British government issued martial law multiple times, requiring that leaks of secrets not cause adverse effects, and foreign forces that may have ill intentions must be expelled. Then the Austrian missionaries became the primary target. Although these magicians were best at take-eye, there was nothing they could do if they didn't practice martial arts. Southern island of Ireland. A black carriage was parked outside the church in Queen Village. The carriage was carved from fine wood. The exquisite horse lanterns, carefully polished metal, and the two horses without mottled hair were all incompatible with this remote village. This quickly attracted onlookers in the village. Some people even naively thought that the British government was going to distribute relief food to them. However, the old people's faces were solemn, and they knew that things were not that simple. Dear Father Hans, Father Lochevin, your journey to Britain has come to an end, and I have been ordered to inform you to leave. Our British priests will take over the church in a month, by which time we hope you will have returned safely to Austria. A British gentleman wearing a black trench coat and a fedora hat said. He always had a smile on his face and gave people a feminine feeling, but some of the words in the sentences were very strong. Sir, I don't understand what you are talking about. Pretending to be stupid is the specialty of these magicians, and Hans and Lochevin are no exception. The gentleman still kept his smile, then repeated what he had just said and added, Father, I'm here on behalf of the British government, and you are Austrians yourself. I hope you will not make things difficult for me, sir. I think you should understand that the church is the dwelling place of God, and we are just servants serving God. Nationality is not important to us, but it's important to us. The young gentleman interrupted the two priests' nonsense. His mission was to expel the Austrians and Italians, although the British government is still not sure what the Austrians are planning. The latter's previous series of actions have put the former into an unprecedented passive situation internationally. We might as well be British, if our identity bothers you, father. Cloven said and handed the other party to £20 notes, which made Father Hans next to him extremely disdainful. Point first, the clergy actually bribed public officials, and second, they actually withheld the residence fee issued by their superiors. In fact, Franz had already considered the possibility of this happening, so he prepared a residency allowance of £50 for some well-run clergy. This was definitely not a small amount at the time, but it could not be said to be very large. £50 was a figure worth fighting for, but not worth fighting for. Father Hans never expected that his brother would actually do this, but what surprised him even more was that the British, who were always greedy, actually refused the bribe. Catholic clergy are often referred to by title or brother. This is not because the bribe is less. On the contrary, £40 is very attractive to such a fledgling affairs officer, but at this time, Britain had clear regulations on accepting foreign populations. 1. Have lived in the UK for at least 5 years. The calculation of length of residence starts from the date of first settling in the UK. If you were born in the UK, you can start counting immediately. It is considered a protocol used for counterintelligence to demonstrate good moral character and ethics. When applying for naturalization, you need to provide a clean criminal record during your residence and other similar documents to prove that you are a citizen of good moral character. Actually, just find a guarantor. 3. Prove that you have a stable residence in the UK. Proof of housing in the UK is required, such as a tenancy agreement or proof of property ownership. It actually proves that you have the ability to live in the UK. This was a complete dimensionality reduction blow to the Austrian Empire's intelligence department. At the same time, Franz, who had been in Austria for a long time, also thought that at this time, as long as he said what country he was from that country. Point at this time, people in Austria, Germany, and most areas of Italy did not have a strict concept of a country, and even nobles and officials could be mobile. Point especially at this time, the Austrian Empire had a large number of exiled nobles and foreign officials. And even many generals who led the army came from the German region. Point in fact, it is very difficult to make statistics even for the Austrian Empire, because there are countries in all directions and there are many ethnic groups in the country. As long as the stowaways know any language in the Austrian Empire, they can successfully smuggle them. Point therefore, the Austrian Navy and Frontier Army always check goods but not people. The difficulty of pretending to be an Austrian is infinitely close to zero, as long as you are not a black man. Point historically, the Austrian Empire did not begin to establish a household registration system until 1886. By the time this system was completed, it was almost entering the 20th century. Point the British household registration system can be traced back to the era of Magna Carta. It can only be said that a single ethnic group and a single language have advantages. On the other hand, Austria, a country that does not even have a dominant ethnic group, seems a bit miserable. Point spies from all over the world can walk unscrupulously on the streets of Vienna, and even members of anti-Austrian organizations like a Jenny could appear at high society balls closer to home. Hans and Lochhaven ultimately failed to convince each other, and had to leave on their own within a month. Point the two priests told the villagers everything, which made the latter angry, because the Irish had no country, no home, no money, and were so poor that they had only faith. Point. But now the British actually want to drive away all the priests from the church, which makes the villagers feel surprisingly angry. Damn Brits. We fought them. Yes. My potatoes are all rotten anyway. I can't survive this winter. I might as well fight with them. Go. Grab their food. We grow the wheat in the British warehouses. Take back what's ours. Seeing the excited villagers picking up shovels, pickaxes and sickles in their hands, the two priests were deeply moved and wanted to work with the villagers to drive away the British. Point. But the reality is that this kind of motley team cannot even defeat the nursing home of a big landowner, let alone the British regular army that is well equipped and capable of fighting. Point. Moreover, they themselves shoulder the mission of the church. Although they have always had doubts about the prophecy and Franz's identity, they can be sure that they did not help others, at least they did not make money, by selling holy water or indulgences. God is merciful and does not want to see you bleeding like a river. We have hidden something under the church cellar. If you can't survive, go inside and get it. So, the two handed a brass key to the villagers, and at the same time, took out the copper, ironware, and grain stored in the church point after the last mass. The church door was locked tightly with heavy chains. May God bless you, and no more diseases and curses will spread in the world. Although the Austrian Empire is not a paradise on earth, life will be easier than in Ireland. The departure of the priest and the closing of the church made the villagers feel even heavier, and what the former said before leaving is also intriguing point. So some people wanted to open the cellar to see what was buried under the church, but this was obviously contrary to the prerequisite of not being able to survive, and many people opposed it point. But the old village chief knew that this was not going to work. Sooner or later, the villagers would be unable to help themselves, and go find out. If there was something really hidden inside, big problems would arise point. So the village chief and several elders in the village decided to let some people go down to see what was inside, but no one was allowed to tell anyone, let alone use it privately point. The team soon gathered together, but the expressions of this group of people came back with different expressions. Some were excited, some were crazy, some were depressed, and some felt that a disaster was coming point. The sentence, although the Austrian Empire is not a paradise on earth, life will be easier than in Ireland, is also thought-provoking. The villagers feel that this is a hint that they can go to Austria to live, but who can send them there? With the exception of Queen's Village, most of the visible presence of the Austrian church on the island of Ireland was uprooted point. To be honest, Franz was quite surprised. He thought the British would not do such a trick point. Archbishop Prussia was even more angry at the British approach. He thought this was a good opportunity to show the power of the church, but he did not expect that he was suddenly sentenced to death when the situation was good in the early stage. Damn Brits, apostles of Satan, why do they stop us from saving the suffering lamb? Archbishop, you don't have to be angry and blame yourself. The church has done a good job this time, but this situation is not something we can stop point. For the people on the island of Ireland, we have done our best and leave the rest to the power of the Lord. Franz rarely uttered such resigned words, which shocked Archbishop Prussia, but not with sadness, but with a heartfelt joy point, because in the eyes of the latter, the former finally began to comply with destiny and listen to God's will point. But in fact, Franz had other things he had to do, and he really couldn't care about a group of foreigners on the island of Ireland right now point. The first is that Montenegro joined the Austrian Empire without the consent of Hungary, so Kossuth made another big move point. Next, Denmark plans to sell Tranquebar, an Indian colony on the Bay of Bengal. Historically it was sold to the British, but at this time Franz was interested. Chapter 609 Auction. Tranquebar, which means the place where the waves sing, was a colony acquired by a captain of the Danish East India Company in 1620, after he conquered the local princely state point. Historically, this small colony brought huge profits to the Kingdom of Denmark. In fact, Denmark once had even greater ideals, but with Christian IV's defeat at the hands of Wallenstein, Denmark's imperial dream was shattered point. Before participating in the 30 Years' War, Denmark united Norway and was known as the Nordic Netherlands with extremely developed industry and commerce. It abolished the privileges of the Hanseatic League and established a powerful sailing fleet. After defeating Sweden, it established Nordic hegemony and went on an expedition to India to establish colonies. However, just when Denmark's power reached its peak, Britain, France, and the Netherlands began to lobby Christian IV to participate in the 30 Years' War and strive for hegemony in Europe. This unscrupulous king was convinced of the weakness of the Holy Roman Empire, and he did not want to be just the overlord of Northern Europe. He also wanted to be the overlord of Northern Germany. After receiving the supplies promised by Britain, France, and the Netherlands, they led the army into the quagmire-like German region. The result was naturally a severe drain on national strength, and what was even more frightening was the brutal and bloody nature of the 30 Years' War, which almost wiped out a generation of Danish people. The Austrian army led by Wallenstein repeatedly ravaged Danish territory, and the powerful fleet that relied on it for survival was also burned. Almost all the former German vassals were liberated, turning the capital into a border battlefield. From then on, Denmark's heart was always exposed to the sharp knife of Germany. The loss of the Sonder Strait has caused Denmark to lose the basis for its dominance in Northern Europe. The rapid decline of Denmark's national power, coupled with the backstabbing of its allies, forced it to withdraw from the war and fully cope with Sweden's challenge. As a result, a strong man fell from the sky in Sweden, and Gustav II turned out to destroy Denmark's last military spirit. In fact, Denmark, which was at its peak at that time, and was able to dominate Northern Europe, was not without talents, but by coincidence. It met the two most capable fighters in the entire 30 Years' War. This is equivalent to Shi Wengan meeting Lu Junai and Phil Buff Wusong. Is Shi Wengan powerful? Must be awesome. But the last two are monsters devastated successively by Wallenstein and Gustavus II, two geniuses who could be written into the world's military history. Denmark has been in decline ever since, and now it can no longer even hold on to its ancestral heritage. Tranquilla was a Danish colony, but it was already surrounded by British colonies. It was only a matter of time before it was lost. It's just that the British offer is a bit outrageous. They plan to pay for the purchase by exempting part of the interest. In fact, the value of this interest is approximately between 80,000 and 100,000 Danish kroner, and the exchange ratio of Danish kroner to British pounds is 19:1. After the transaction was successful, the Danish castles, churches, docks, farmland, and slaves on the land of Tranquilla were all owned by the British. The value of these things far exceeds the amount paid by the British. This is simply half sale and half free. But at that time, Denmark could not find other buyers, and even the French did not dare to take the offer. After all, in terms of strength in Asia, even the great powers together were not enough to compete with the United Kingdom. However, due to historical changes, Austria, the Netherlands, and France all showed interest in the Danish colonies at this time. Austria needed a transit station in India. Although France was prospering in the British Indian colonies through bribery, buying, and supporting agents at this time, no one could guarantee that this situation would continue. After all, whether it is a lion or an elephant, there will always be a day when they wake up. Moreover, after being disgusted by the British for so long, it is time to fight back. India, as a taboo of the British Empire, is also its most painful. In fact, the Sikh War at this time was not a long-planned war as they thought, but a war promoted by Franz. The purpose of this is not only to weaken Britain, but also to make it have no time to take care of other things. After all, Franz does not want to do such a thing as pulling a tooth from a tiger's mouth, unless the tiger is too stunned to think of a counterattack. In addition to Caroline's assistance, the Netherlands' national strength has been greatly enhanced after annexing the Flemish region and joining the German customs union. At least the king's power and influence reached unprecedented heights, and the alliance with Austria greatly strengthened the Netherlands' ties with Southeast Asia. Under these stimulations, the merchant king was eager to take back the power of the Dutch East India Company so as to restore the former glory of the sea coachman. In addition to wanting to expand their territory in Southeast Asia, the French were also fed up with the exploitation and extortion of the British. Of course, the most important thing besides this is that Louis Philippe wants to join in the fun. Yes, he wanted to know what Austria wanted to do and get a piece of the pie more than expanding his territory in Southeast Asia and getting rid of the British. In fact, in order to prevent the French from making a comeback, the British restricted the former very tightly in Southeast Asia. Of course, the same goes for other countries, including Austria. After all, no overlord is willing to give up its interests. In essence, Britain still hopes to dominate the Far East and the Indian subcontinent. During this period in history, it was indeed difficult for Western powers to reach out to these places, but there were new changes at this time. First, Austria conquered Chenla with a few hundred people, and then the Dutch and Spanish mainlands were strengthened, and then strengthened their colonization of Southeast Asia. Then Louis Philippe's expanded ambitions strengthened France's power in a Southeast Asia point on the other hand, Britain has suffered frequent setbacks in international affairs, and its invincible pressure has been greatly reduced point diplomatically. Although Europe is still divided, many relatively stable small groups have formed, which has further reduced Britain's influence point. Military losses were equally fatal. Whether it was the sinking of the fleet in the Near East crisis, the tragedy of being annihilated by pirates on the island of Kalimantan, or the war of attrition in southern Brazil at this time, the British Army's vigor was greatly reduced. The above are all war plots mentioned in the previous article, so I won't go into details here. The minds of the powerful powers became active, especially with the Austrian Empire taking the lead. The Netherlands and France were naturally willing to follow and take a share of the pie. However, this situation angered British Prime Minister Robert Peel. He did not expect the Austrian revenge to come so quickly. Of course, it is not difficult to scare the latter away, as long as the troops on the Indian subcontinent are moved near the Danish colonies, but as a result, the 45,000 strong army that had just been assembled would be dispersed again, and the 60,000 strong Sikh army was already ready. Will retreating at this time cause the other party to pursue you like a hungry wolf? In that case, Britain would face the danger of being attacked from both sides in the Indian subcontinent. Robert Peel didn't want to take the risk, because Britain's hegemony was already riddled with holes, so he decided to use money to solve the problem. Chapter 610 Auction. Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. Christian VIII was surprised by the amazing offers he heard. At first he just wanted to sell these colonies to survive the financial crisis. After all, the value of these lands far away from Denmark is constantly declining, and they are long-term threatened by the British. It is better to sell them than to live in fear, but the British offer was so low that it was simply robbery. However, if no one bids, Christian VIII will have no choice but to agree to this loss-making transaction. Then the helpful Franz suggested to him that a public auction could be used to curb the British's malicious bargaining behavior. Christian VIII thought over and over again, and felt that it was the buyer who had offended the British anyway, so he could not be blamed. So he started the auction. It is not common to auction colonies, so he deliberately chose Frankfurt, a neutral city. Soon the starting price of the Danish colony in India rose from the starting price of 100,000 Danish crowns to 700,000 Danish crowns, and the bidder was naturally the Habsburg family. As for the reason, there is no need at all. After all, it is completely reasonable for this family that can colonize deserts and glaciers to colonize India. But Robert Peel didn't want to worry about that. He just wanted to ensure the eternal foundation of the British Empire. And Charles Canning, who was at the auction, was a staunch anti-Austrian, and it was impossible for Austria to gain any benefit. So the British bid 1 million Danish kroner. Before Christian VIII on the stage could get excited, the Austrians raised the price to 1.5 million. Charles Canning had no choice but to raise the price to 1.6 million. Followed by 1.7 million, 1.8 million, and 1.9 million. Finally, the price was raised to 3 million Danish kroner, equivalent to £157,900. At this time, Charles Canning was sweating profusely because these bad lands were not worth that much. In order to prevent the Austrians and French from maliciously raising the price, Robert Peel allocated £200,000 to Canning. It should have been more than enough, but now the Austrian side has no intention of stopping. Canning became even more depressed when he saw that a half-year-old child, Franz, was participating in the auction. Because when such rich young people are full of enthusiasm, it is possible to raise the price to 10 million. At the same time, Canning has also heard many rumors about Franz. He doesn't know whether they are true or false, but he is definitely spoiled. To be honest, Canning really hated participating in the same auction with such a spoiled rich young man. Also disgusting to him were the pair King Louis Philip and the merchant King William II. 3.1 million. The British bidders 3.1 million. Does anyone want to increase the price? The venue was filled with murmurs. 3 million and 1 million. Once there was silence in the meeting place. 3 million and 1 million. Twice, Canning breathed a sigh of relief, and it seemed that he finally got over it. But before he could catch his breath, Franz raised the sign again. 3 million and 2 million. The Austrian Empire offers 3 million and 2 million. Cunning looked over immediately, and he clearly saw a mocking smile on the other person's face. As if this was just a game point, the price continued to soar, and soon reached 4 million. At this time, Cunning finally discovered a problem, whether it was Louis Philippe, the Pear King, William II, the Merchant King, or Francis, who had been causing trouble. Lance, they all seemed to be in cahoots and only bid against him. Point at this time, the price had exceeded the price allocated by Congress. It was impossible for Cunning to pay for the auction out of his own pocket, but he did not want it to be easy for his British competitors. The final price was raised to 5 million Danish kroner, approximately £263,100, as continuing to soar would do no good for the UK. Point, because when it comes to hating Britain, the Danes are definitely at the top of the list. The sinking of the fleet, the burning of the city, the massacre in the capital, these are things the Danes can forget. Point, if one day they can rise up, the first people to take revenge will be the British. Even if they cannot rise up, whoever beats the British and the Danes will still be willing to help. Point, although Denmark is only an island country, it was once the overlord of Northern Europe and even invaded Great Britain. This makes the United Kingdom dare not look down upon it, not to mention that the latter is not an island country. Cunning did not have the courage to speak harshly like Palmerston, so he could only leave in embarrassment. Point, Christian 8 was very satisfied with the results of the auction. Although he had to pay a 10% commission to the German Confederation, it was still a good deal compared to selling it to the UK for 100,000 Danish kroner. However, the most profitable countries are Austria, France and the Netherlands. In fact, Cunning's guess is correct. Austria, France, and the Netherlands have long been colluding. Instead of fighting alone, it is better to join forces and compete with the British. Point, moreover, the Danish colonies in India were not only in Tranquilla, Tamil Nadu, but also in Serampore, Calcutta and the Nicobar Islands. These three colonies have their own characteristics and can just meet the different needs of the three countries. Austria and France are powerful countries, so they prefer land on land. Point, Serampore was close to Calcutta, the largest opium distribution center in the 19th century, and the French naturally hoped to get a share of the opium trade. Point, the Nicobar Islands are located overseas and far away from the British. They are safe and the Dutch have rich experience in ruling small islands. As for Tranquilla's strategic location close to the Pork Strait, it also has a relatively complete infrastructure and a relatively stable governance foundation after 200 years of Danish management. Point, at the same time, there is another advantage, that is, it is close enough to Sri Lanka. Point, in order to finally defeat the British, Austria, France and the Netherlands prepared a total of 10 million Danish kroner, but in fact only half was used, so it was considered a small victory. Point, according to the previously agreed distribution principle, the Netherlands needs to pay half of the cost, which is 2.5 million, because the Nicobar Islands is the most advantageous location, and also because the Netherlands is the weakest member of the three countries. Austria and France each paid 1.25 million Danish kroner, approximately 657,800 florins. This is not a big figure for Austria and France. It is not even enough for both parties to spend time in Luxembourg and Alsace-Lorraine. The cost of moving troops during the two crises, but letting everyone share the benefits is a necessary behavior at this time, because no country in Austria, France, or the Netherlands can withstand the anger of the British. Point, however, the alliance of the three countries and the approaching Sikh war made the British afraid to act rashly. Point, the reason why the British dared to take action against the Sikhs was because after the death of Ranjit Singh, the originally powerful Sikh empire staged many dramas of fatherly kindness and filial piety, brotherly friendship and brotherly respect, and even a battle between illegitimate children. In the end, the wife of a branch of the branch was regent on behalf of the youngest son, and the power of the country was actually controlled by the army. Point, not only did this emperor have weak legitimacy, but he was also too young to be in charge. His relatives were involved in the government, there were many internal factions, and the local military had exclusive power. Therefore, this was the time when the Sikh Empire was at its weakest. Point, the British would naturally not let go of this opportunity to unify the Indian subcontinent in one fell swoop, but what they didn't know was that there was still a pair of eyes staring at them from the north. Chapter 611, Scabies disease. London, England. Robert Peel was not too surprised by Canning's failure, but the splitting into 3 did disgust him. This time the opponents changed from 1 to 3, and the script seemed like it shouldn't be like this according to Robert Peel's plan. He was prepared to make those who dared to challenge the dignity of the British Empire lose both money and territory. After all, the Indian subcontinent is Britain's home turf, and it has defeated countless enemies here. No country could challenge the British in the Indian subcontinent, and he was only one step away from unifying India. However, the number of enemies changed from one weak country, Denmark, to 3 powerful countries, Austria, France, and the Netherlands, which still made Robert Peel feel the malice of the great powers. But this is not important. After all, after the Sikh Empire is solved, Britain will have many ways and time to drive Austria and France out of the Indian subcontinent. As for the Dutch, Robert Peel really didn't take them seriously. For 200 years, the British developed on the corpses of the Dutch. The merchant king may be good at economics, but domestic politics are in a mess, with religious and ethnic conflicts continuing, and the method William II came up with is to send all those who oppose him to Austria. The Dutch fleet is still at the level of the 18th century, and may not even be able to defeat the maritime powers of the time. The upper limit is too low. France chose Serampore, which was very close to Calcutta, and its purpose was very clear, which was for the opium trade. At this time, the British were making a lot of money from the opium trade with East. Louis Philippe was jealous, and had established the French Far East Company a few years ago, but it never opened up. Now that they have Serampore, the French will definitely take the opportunity to transport opium in large quantities to the Far East. But this is not a bad thing for the British, because they can also get a piece of the pie, and have one more dealer. It's just that France seems to be a little too strong now. Whether it is its 650,000 standing army, the largest in Europe, or its global colonial area, the UK is worried. The Qing dynasty, the world's largest population, has 800,000. France has the second, 650,000, and Russia, the third, has 600,000. The former colonial empire seems to be back, especially since France gained too many benefits in the US-Mexican War, and at the same time, acquired large tracts of land in North Africa, West Africa, and Central America. In fact, there were conflicts between Britain and France in Oceania and the Far East, but the two more often joined forces to bully the indigenous people in these two places. According to the current situation, France has surrounded Mexico. Once the former swallows the latter, France will not only gain massive resources, but also split the Americas into 2. Robert Peel didn't dare to think how strong France would be like that, but what caused this situation to happen was that he didn't expect Austria to directly choose to give in during the US-Mexican War. To be honest, the battlefield is the same as the gambling table. The more you win, the harder you lose, the harder it is to give up. It was precisely because of this that Robert Peel chose to add insult to injury. He hoped that Austria would engage in a protracted war of attrition in order to defend Mexico and France. After all, Austria had achieved so many victories before, and Robert Peel did not think that the former would retreat before engaging the French army. Because both strong people and powerful countries have one characteristic in common, that is, they will not give up easily. But the Austrians' approach surprised the British. They chose to cut their losses as soon as France entered the war, without even symbolic resistance. As a result, Austria and France ended the war with almost no injuries, which frustrated Britain's plan to make war fortune and use the war to maintain the balance of power on the European continent. Austria still maintains a strong influence in Europe, while the French appear to be too powerful in North America. Neither the United States nor Mexico can fight France alone. Therefore, Britain must suppress France to prevent it from continuing to grow. As for the Holy Alliance, Britain has not joined at all, and the countries of the Holy Alliance only care about whether France becomes bigger in Europe, and do not care whether it competes with Britain for hegemony. Attack France and the United States overseas, conquer India in the Far East and the East. Attack Austria's power in Central Europe, prevent Russia from gaining access to the sea, prevent the merger of Spain and France, invade Brazil, and control the South American market. In addition, we must continue to conquer land and prevent colonial uprisings according to Robert Peel's plan. A war between Austria and France in North America would not only weaken the latter's strength and prevent further expansion, but also reduce the former's international influence. Then, once Austria was defeated, its status within the German Confederation would decline. Prussia would then challenge German leadership, and the region would return to chaos. A weak and loose German confederation was necessary, but Britain would not let this organization disband, because the latter also needed the former to stop Russia's westward advance. Therefore, Austria plus Germany is greater than or equal to Russia. It is very necessary for Britain, but it cannot be allowed to merge, even with a suture monster like the Holy Roman Empire. But now all these plans have come to nothing, and then they offended Austria over the Strait of Otranto. Now the Austrians would go all the way to buy a fortress on the Indian subcontinent, and specifically choose it near the Pork Strait. This is completely disgusting. In fact, France is also disgusting. Tranquilla has very complete defense facilities and is relatively far away from the core of British rule. At the same time, there is still a certain depth. The British cannot solve the problem by relying on the navy alone, and whether they send marines to land or mobilize troops from other areas, there are great risks after all. It is not uncommon for those duplicitous Indians to stab someone in the back, especially in a battle with a great power like Austria. Any variable could be fatal. In addition, France and the Netherlands cannot wait to be slaughtered. They will definitely try their best to cause trouble for the UK. After all, coupled with this auction, all fools know that Austria, France, and the Netherlands have something fishy to do. But because it is close to the Pork Strait and Sri Lanka, the UK really cannot ignore it. Relatively speaking, Austria has little interest in the Far East, and it does not engage in opium or slave trade. In fact, it has the least conflict of interest with Britain. But it is undeniable that this country is rising, and at this time Austria's influence has reached its maximum after the Congress of Vienna. At the same time, the level of industry is steadily improving, and some technologies have even surpassed that of Britain. In addition, the colonies are also expanding. Although the colonial area is not as large as that of Britain and France, the colonial development is extremely fast and stable, and the possibility of catching up from behind cannot be ruled out. Therefore, Robert Peel would not allow Austria's trade in the East to further expand, nor would he allow the Netherlands and France to divide their interests, but the current situation does not allow it. Because a war that has been planned for many years and the final step to conquer India will begin at this time. Therefore, Robert Peel could only choose to make concessions, but as long as Britain unified India, it would only be a matter of time before these scabies diseases were eliminated. Chapter 612. The war begins. Sir Henry Harding was the governor of the British Indian colonies at this time. He participated in the Napoleonic Wars and defeated the main French army commanded by Soult with 7,000 remaining soldiers in the Peninsular War. During the Battle of Ligny, Sir Henry Harding found that the Prussian army was too scattered, but neither Blücher nor the Prussian chief of staff Gneisenau refused to listen to the arrogance of a young man in his early 20s. As a result, the Prussian army was directly defeated by Napoleon, and he could only withdraw from the battlefield. First, Sir Henry Harding lost his left arm in this battle, but he did not surrender or withdraw from the battle. Instead, he injured the pain of a broken arm and caught up with the Prussian army and urged the opponent to return to the war. Blücher paid great respect to this brave young man, and eventually the Prussian army arrived at Waterloo as planned, giving Napoleon and his empire the final blow. The Duke of Wellington called him the bravest Englishman, and in recognition of his achievements, the Duke of Wellington presented Napoleon's sword to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Harding. It's just that this brave soldier never participated in a war after the end of the Napoleonic War, but devoted himself to politics. It was not until the eve of the Sikh War that he was recommended as the Governor General of India. Because the war launched against the Sikh Empire at that time was well received in the country, but no one was sure that this powerful enemy could be solved. The Sikh Empire, once ruled by Karan Singh, can definitely be called a powerful enemy. To give a more intuitive example, The Sikh Empire's fiscal revenue in 1839 was as high as 50 million rupees, nearly half of the Austrian empires during the same period in history. The exchange rate between the florin and the rupee is very close, about 1 to 1.09. At that time, the defense expenditure of the Sikh Empire was as high as 45%. So the weapons and equipment of Karan Singh's new army could be called luxury. The 80,000 strong new army has more than 600 French artillery and 70,000 Delvine 1826 rifles. The literacy rate of the soldiers is as high as 60%, far exceeding that of the European armies of the same period. There is also a corps of 300 French instructors, including many senior officers who participated in the Napoleonic Wars, and even directly hired French people as army commanders. In addition, Karan Singh can also recruit about 35,000 tribal armed men and nearly 10,000 fanatic believers. However, all these glories disappeared with the death of Gilan Singh. The continued turmoil in the country caused the tribes that he had previously subjugated to begin to obey him. Local landowners and officials began to work together to line their own pockets, and national finances declined rapidly. Ethnic and religious conflicts also broke out here, with a massive loss of population, desolate land, bandits everywhere, and shrinking business. On the other hand, the status of the army continued to improve, and the financial support it requested continued to increase. By 1843, the emperor wanted to get 400,000 rupees to repair the garden, but he had no money. The military association Kazakh controlled national politics to a certain extent, and purged a large number of officers loyal to the royal family. However, a skinny camel was bigger than a horse. At this time, the Sikh Empire could still muster an army of 60,000 people. Although Henry Harding was brave, he was not a reckless man. He refused to accept London's order and advanced directly into Punjab. Instead, he chose the relatively safe strategy of building high walls and hoarding grain. This is partly because of Henry Harding's personal caution, and partly because both of the two warring factions in history have died in battle. An old general died on the way to quell the chaos, and Hugao lost his life on the island of Kalimantan. Without the interference of these two local powerful factions, Henry Harding chose a completely different style of play from history. He prepared to encircle the Sikh Empire, using fortresses and bunkers to build a camp step by step. The French staff officers in the Sikh army discovered the British intentions immediately. However, due to the chaos within the Sikh Empire at that time, it was not until a few months later that the top brass discovered that Henry Harding was trying to surround them. The Sikh Empire once again fell into chaos, and eventually Queen Regent Jinda's faction gained the upper hand. Then they hurriedly declared war on Britain, led by Degga Singh and Lal Singh. The two men served as commander-in-chief at the same time, and the operation of commanding the troops separately was very confusing. But in fact, the two men came from different factions, so they wanted to kill each other more than the British. On the other hand, Henry Harding also lamented the poor combat power of the Indians. He even suspected that the Indian soldiers in front of him were not even as good as the Spanish. This strengthened Henry Harding's strategy of shrinking, but what made him depressed was that after waiting in the fortress for almost a month, he did not see a single Sikh soldier. On the contrary, many locals risked their lives to sell goods and serve as coolie. Due to the excessive expropriation of the Sikh Empire over the years, the people have long been in dire straits. Compared with working as a coolie for the Sikh army, the reward for working for the British is much more generous, and at least they can have enough to eat. There are many people waiting to see the fireworks, but a month is indeed too long. Both Degga Singh and Lal Singh hoped that the other party could fight to the death with the British and then reap the benefits, so they were unwilling to be the first person. Historically, Lal Singh's troops collided with Hugao's vanguard, but now the latter has turned to dust. Henry Harding was determined not to leave, because he felt that it was not a wise move to lead a group of Asan rashly into the enemy's hinterland. As a result, both sides were exhausted, but soon the Sikh Empire's supplies could not keep up. Dega Singh and Lal Singh had no choice but to agree to attack the British army at the same time. Finally seeing the army of the Sikh Empire, the British troops in the fortress were quite excited, because as long as the battle was over they could return to their respective areas and become local overlords. But this excitement soon disappeared, because the Sikh army's firepower far exceeded the imagination of the British army. Historically, the British army was stunned by the Sikh artillery. At that time, Hugao used experience to judge that bringing 20 to 30 artillery pieces was enough to defeat the opponent. As a result, the other party brought more than 200 artillery pieces, which were directly smashed to pieces by the British Indian colonial army and employees of the East India Company. Although Henry Harding ordered the construction of city walls and fortresses at this time, Asson's architectural skills could only create some superficial things. The British army was at a huge disadvantage. As soon as the war began, the walls and fortresses they relied on could not provide them with much protection. In fact, French goods were quite scary at the time. Although there were many antiques from the French Revolution, they could not be blocked by the old-fashioned city walls temporarily built by the Indians. In fact, Henry Harding did not think of this. He just hoped to reduce the loss a little. I didn't expect the opponent's firepower to be so fierce. Fortunately, he specially brought some siege artillery. At least it didn't fall too far in terms of power in the artillery battle between the two sides. The Sikhs clearly had the advantage, so Dega Singh and Lal Singh became a little swollen. The two men simultaneously ordered preparations to attack the city. Whoever defeated the British first would be the future leader of Khaza. Chapter 613. The war is over. The Sikh shelling caused obvious chaos to the British army, but fortunately Henry Harding had seen worse situations before. Although the morale of the British Indian army was low and military discipline was lax, there was still no big problem if they were just defending the city. Of course, this is also inseparable from the fact that Sir Henry Harding has been boosting morale on the front line and the black missiles in the hands of the supervising team. 4 hours after the war started, the Sikh army took the lead in ceasefire. This was certainly not because it was lunch break, but the special envoy, supervisor of Queen Jindal felt that such a fight was a waste of money. Dega Singh and Lal Singh brought nearly 400 artillery pieces, and the fight was all money. Since the death of Karan Singh, the Sikh Empire's financial revenue has plummeted. This is not because the master favored the late emperor, but because they, the younger generation, were really unworthy of human beings. In less than 5 years, they ruined the foundation built by their predecessors over 50 years. Guru is God in the Sikh system. By 1845, the Sikh Empire's financial revenue had dropped to less than 10 million rupees, and the national treasury could not even raise 300,000 rupees. However, compared to stopping the shelling, the Sikh army's next operation was wise. Dega Singh and Lal Singh's understanding of war can be described in 3 words as frame a point. In fact, the scene that followed the battle was quite grand. Sikh troops all over the mountains and plains rushed towards the British fortress, which had mostly collapsed. Especially the loud war drums and deafening roars frightened the Indians who were repairing the fortress. The Sikh charge formation is in the traditional inverted pin shape. This tactic is also called the horn formation and looks equally impressive. It's just that I couldn't take a closer look because the formation soon disappeared, replaced by chaotic footsteps and noisy sounds. The most outrageous thing is that the cavalry actually launched a charge together with the infantry and militiamen. Even if the former held back their strength, they quickly separated from the charging team. Then these cavalry became the targets of the defenders. In fact, the temporary city wall built by Henry Harding was not high, only about 1.5 meters high and 0.4 meters wide, and it was mostly made of mud and bricks. The shelling just now has caused the collapse of a large area of the city wall. Theoretically, it is possible for the cavalry to break through the defense with a single charge, or at least occupy some gaps to clear the way for subsequent troops. However, under the continuous firing of the British siege guns and Brunswick rifles, this group of Sikh cavalry made an astonishing move. That is, they dismounted and fired at the British troops on the spot, while still hiding behind their horses. This tactic of deceiving others is Lal Singh's favorite work. It looks unique and theoretically feasible, but why hasn't it been used by anyone before? He didn't think about it. This was the first time that the Sikh cavalry carried out this tactic on the battlefield. As you can imagine, the result was that the British troops, who had been somewhat complacent, suddenly turned into brave men and began to use the city wall to stand up. Finally, after losing dozens of cavalry, this cavalry regiment of thousands of people collapsed. The fleeing cavalry dispersed the infantry team behind them. Even if the French instructors broke their whips, they could not control the formation. The French knew this messy formation very well, and even Napoleon could only shake his head when he came. But it is not impossible to save, that is, the column charge tactic. During the French Revolution, the most common tactic used by the French army was to break through quickly in columns and then form a local firepower advantage. Column tactics, column tactics, almost all the French officers shouted at the same time. However, due to the previous continuous turmoil and purges, not all Sikh soldiers could understand the French officers' tactical orders. However, under the continuous bombardment and the continuous efforts of the officers, several columns were still reluctantly formed. Sir Henry Harding in the fortress was extremely familiar with this tactic. He knew what the opponent was going to do and how to restrain it. Change to solid bullets. Quick. Adjust the muzzle and kill their vanguard. Let Major General Osborne come over. I want him to block the gap in front of him no matter what. Solid bullets are very suitable for dealing with column tactics, because as long as they hit, they can bring up a bunch of blood goods. In addition, column tactics are extremely impactful, and it is obviously difficult for Indian soldiers to stop the progress of this torrent. Sir Henry Harding immediately chose to let his most elite troops go forward. The 4 regiments led by Major General Osborne totaled 7,000 people, all from the British mainland, with excellent weapons and well-trained training. If it hadn't come to a critical moment, the former would not want to use this force at all. But he knew very well that, if he could not block this wave of attacks now, then the entire defense would most likely be torn apart, causing a huge rout. By that time, Major General Osborne's troops will be intact and unable to recover. The war seems to have reached a critical moment, but the French have ignored one issue. If the Sikh army had been led by Gillant Singh, they might have been able to replicate the victory during the French Revolution. However, after continuous turmoil and several years of purges, the Sikh army's combat effectiveness and fighting will have plummeted. In the end, it only took a few rounds of artillery shells to defeat the legion that was like a torrent before. Osborne's troops had just deployed, and the two sides had not yet contacted. This made the latter very depressed, and could only look at his old superior from a distance. Sir Henry Harding was even more depressed. He originally thought that there was going to be a battle like sparks hitting the earth, but it ended just as fireworks were set off. The most depressing thing was that the enemy retreated too early, and he did not dare to pursue them, because the distance between the two sides was not enough, because the Sikhs had too many artillery. Prodigious Singh and Lal Singh looked at the retreating army. Their first action was to kill the eunuch sent by Jinder. Then the two of them started a desperate run in perfect agreement. Seeing the coaches running away, the officers were naturally not far behind. At this time, I have to say that the French still have a spirit of contract. Even though the employers have given up, they still led the Sikh soldiers to retreat in an orderly manner, destroying the materials and facilities that could not be taken away. Sir Henry Harding looked at what was happening in front of him with a depressed face. He felt that there was no logic in it all. Sir Henry Harding had just hid in the basement of the fortress because he was sure that the Sikhs would definitely start a second round of bombardment. As a result, after waiting for a long time, Henry Harding did not wait for the bombardment as he imagined. When he came to the fortress again, the Sikh camp was already in flames, and only a pile of corpses were left on the battlefield. Although this was a battle without any honor, it was a good thing for Britain, because it meant that it could deal with the most difficult enemy on the Indian subcontinent without a single blow. In fact, Queen Jindal not only sent war supervisors to Degger Singh and Lal Singh, but also sent a letter of surrender to the British, stating that she was willing to downgrade the empire to a kingdom and become a vassal of the British. She cares more about the stability of her power than the interests of the Sikh kingdom. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 614 War resumes. To be honest, Franz had also thought about strengthening the Sikh Empire before to let them last a little longer, but almost all the intelligence coming from India repeatedly told one thing: it's rotten and can't be saved. It is difficult to imagine that a country can decay so quickly, but in fact the decay of this country did not start after the death of Current Singh. Rather, today's outcome was destined from the beginning of the country's establishment, but it was simply suppressed by a powerful monarch. Franz had also tried to establish trade ties with this region, but the reality was that it was simply impossible, not to mention that the Sikh government at this time only wanted to have free prostitution. Even if Franz didn't care about the weapons and just wanted to cause trouble for the British, since the Sikh Empire did not have a coast, trade with it would have to go through the hands of other princely states. The Sikhs have a very poor relationship with both the native Hinduism in the Indian subcontinent and the foreign heavenly sect. The surrounding princely states did not want the Sikhs to grow bigger. If Franz wanted to force trade with the Sikh Empire, he would not only lose a lot of money, but also offend those princely states that originally had good intentions towards Austria. In addition, the Sikh Empire was in the signed clean and had no danger of defending. It was only a matter of time before they were conquered by the British. Moreover, Franz had prepared a backup man many years ago, a backup man that the British could never get rid of. With the disastrous defeat of Dega Singh and Lal Singh, the Sikh Empire could only retreat again and again. Coupled with the internal support of Queen Jinder, Sir Henry Harding felt that he could return before Christmas. Arrived in England. To be honest, he didn't have any good impression of this country full of curry and opium. In comparison, the acid rain and smog in London were so friendly. However, Sir Henry Harding soon received the bad news that Akbar Khan's troops had defeated the British troops guarding the Kabul Pass and had invaded the Kalat Khanate. This situation could not be worse for the British. That is, the British army is most likely to continue to attack as a wedding dress for the Afghans, but giving up the attack would be equivalent to giving the Sikhs a chance to breathe, and all previous efforts would be in vain. Over the past few days, Sir Henry Harding has felt the difference between Sikhs and Indians. Although they cannot be compared with the troops of the great powers, they are not comparable to his group of curry eaters. In fact, the authentic Indian Asan should refer to the Sikhs. Historically, after the Sikh Empire was conquered by the British, a large number of Sikhs were recruited to the Far East. For example, the famous Battle of Bali Bridge was actually a battle between the Sikh cavalry and the Manchus and Mongols. Union cavalry. In addition, they can be found everywhere in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. During the colonial era, the Sikhs have always been the pawns of the British. As for the image of Sikhs, if you can't remember the image in Hong Kong movies in the past, you can think of the Indian in I played with mud in the northeast. Although Franz did not think that the Sikhs could have any impact on the European war, he did not want the British to gain any benefits. As for convincing the Afghans, it was actually very easy. Because Akbar Khan's hatred of the British and his desire to build a powerful empire made him covet India. Franz only needed accurate intelligence and a detailed pros and cons analysis to get Akbar Khan to send troops. At this time, the Sikh Empire had just been established for a few decades, and there were still a large number of Shah and Fang sect forces in the territory. If the Sikhs cannot stand up, then Franz can use the Afghans to take their ecological niche and continue to cause trouble to the British. At this time, Sir Henry Harding had realized that he could not solve the Indian problem with his own power alone. He had intelligence about Afghanistan. This Akbar Khan is undoubtedly a difficult opponent, and his army is different from the Sikhs. They are not soldiers, but a group of bandits. Once they are allowed to penetrate deep into the hinterland of India, the damage caused will be immeasurable. Sir Henry Harding could only leave 10,000 people to negotiate with the Sikh Empire, and he led the main force to a decisive battle with Akbar Khan's main force. The war in the north made the entire Indian subcontinent become restless again. At this time, the tranquewa purchased by France seemed particularly cost-effective. After all, the defense facilities were complete, and even the managers were ready. There is not much difference between Danish and German, and it is not unusual for Danes to speak German. The most important thing is that the asking prices of these Danes are very low, and Franz will naturally not mind spending a little more. to buy a more stable transition period. In fact, Franz was a little unfounded, because the Indians didn't care at all about who ruled them. In fact, after dozens or even hundreds of generations of manual screening, there are really not many rebellious people in India. Even if he wants to resist, he won't be like his neighbor next door who says, princes, generals, Xiangning, etc., but will do it under the banner of loyalty to Omar, or something else. In addition, Tranquebar is far from being a land that cannot make ends meet, as King Christian VIII of Denmark knew. In fact, it is rich in spices and crops, and has rich fishery resources. Not to mention how much economic benefits it can bring to the local area, but it is self-sufficient. It's perfectly fine to be self-sufficient. For Austria, the most important thing is its strategic value. After all, in the British ports, you always have to look at other people's faces to act. In order to ensure the smooth flow of shipping routes, Franz sent millions of florins in bribes to Calcutta and Bombay every year. Now that Tranquebar has managed the costs, it will save a lot, and it can also promote the development of this colony, thus turning it into a truly feng shui treasure land. After this transaction, Austria can completely use the Duchess Nicobar Islands and its own Tranquebar to solve the root problem. Not only can it avoid being exploited by the British, but it can also prevent being backstabbed by the French. At this time, the French colony of Serampore was in a very embarrassing situation. It could not solve the Indian Ocean route problem, and offended the British. The French can only turn to its enemy Austria or the United Kingdom for help, and both have reasons to cut off the French Indian Ocean route, but they still have to be peaceful to make money. Louis Philippe's calculation was very good. The French government first signed a 3-year contract with Austria in order to ensure the smooth flow of the Indian Ocean route. At the same time, it was also to throw the blame to Austria and let it attract the hatred of the British. But what he didn't expect was that Britain had no time to look east at this time, and the war in the northwest continued. Coupled with the turmoil on the rear, Robert Peel even wrote to Prince Metternich stating that the British Empire had always been the best friend of the Austrian Empire, and hoped that the two could support each other to create a better future. Although Metternich knew that what the other party told was a lie, he was still very moved, and expressed his willingness to live in peace with the British Empire and maintain peace in Europe. Britain and Austria then sent thousands more troops to southern Albania and Tranquebar respectively. Chapter 615 about Albania. The British were not comfortable in Albania. The puppet they supported, the Sini Mustafa, raised an anti-British banner after receiving the previously promised weapons and assistance. The British Army's strength of only 3,000 men was really difficult to cope with the situation at this time. Of course, the British were not idiots, and they quickly found the source of the turmoil from their weapons. After all, the rebels are filled with a large number of Austrian weapons, and anyone who is not a fool can see who is causing trouble. The British government immediately protested to Austria, and also expressed its views to the Ottoman government. But on the surface, this letter is still a personal letter, written by a teacher to a student. Cunning once served as Majid's nominal teacher, which made the former feel it was a very honorable thing. Given the current situation in Albania, I have reason to suspect that the unrest within your country was orchestrated by the Austrians. To prevent further damage to your country's interests, I recommend that your government take back control of northern Albania. After this kind of private letter was made public, it immediately caused an uproar. In particular, some small businessmen, petty officials, and soldiers of the new army in the Ottoman Empire, as well as student parties, demanded war with the Austrian Empire, and went to Vienna to unseat their idiot emperor. As for why such a confidential letter was made public, anyone who is not stupid can guess it. At the same time, the British also bribed several senior officials of the Ottoman Empire to help fuel the situation. These people were inextricably linked to the British and naturally would not disappoint their masters. However, this caused panic among Megid and the new Grand Vizier Kuja, because they knew very well what the Ottoman Empire was like. It's good that the Austrians didn't fight, but those unruly people actually wanted to fight. You must know that the former is an ally of Russia. According to the alliance agreement, if Austria is attacked, Russia will send troops to join the war within 3 months. However, Majid felt that the Russians would not wait 3 months. They would immediately cooperate with the Austrian attack along the Danube River. By then, it would not only be Albania that would be lost. Moreover, Majid is very satisfied with the current situation in northern Albania and does not think it is an invasion at all. After all, the Austrians will pay management fees in advance, and the Ottomans can even station officials and troops. Of course, Majid is not that stupid, and would really send troops into the mountains of northern Albania. After all, local bandits are rampant, and it is not impossible to loot the troops, but he still had the guts to send some officials to live on free wages. In fact, these officials were sent to Vienna by the Austrian side to entertain them with delicious food and drinks. Naturally, they would not report any unfavorable information to Austria to Majid. As for conspiracy to plot unrest, it is even more nonsense. After all, Albania has been in turmoil for hundreds of years. In fact, Majid understood that the British wanted to use his hand to put pressure on the Austrians, but the most fundamental problem was that the Ottoman Empire at this time did not have this ability. Moreover, expelling the Austrian Empire from Albania did not bring any benefit to the Ottoman Empire. On the contrary, it offended the former severely. In addition, tearing up the agreement was too detrimental to the latter, a weak country. This is equivalent to tying the ships of the Ottoman Empire and the British together. Once the latter feels that the former has not lost its use value, it may skin and eat the flesh at any time, or even feed it to other beasts. In addition, the attitude of the Russians is also an important reason for Majid's hesitation. If the former also tears up the agreement and chooses to side with the United Kingdom, it will be easy to drive the Austrians out of Albania. On the contrary, it would be difficult for the British alone to do it. If Russia joins the battle in compliance with the alliance, the Ottoman Empire will suffer catastrophe. After all, no matter how powerful the British were, they could not face two land powers at the same time. However, the national sentiment in the country must also be taken care of. Majid does not want to end up like Louis XVI. As a result, the Ottoman Empire adopted the procrastination strategy. Majid hoped to wait until the situation became clearer before making a decision. He did not want to become cannon fodder for the British to explore the way. As a result, the Ottoman Empire only issued a statement that it was about to intervene in the investigation, which made the British very unhappy. In fact, from the latter's perspective, the former can completely ask the Austrians to withdraw from Ottoman territory, and if the other side refuses, Britain can intervene. It's just that the former really doesn't dare to let a weak country take the initiative to tear up an agreement reached between the powers bordering it. Stupid. Coward. No wonder the Ottoman Empire has fallen to what it is today. Cunning, who was in Whitehall, referring to the British Parliament, stamped his feet in anger, but this did not help, because this was already the strongest decision Majid could make. Robert Peel sighed. I'm afraid it won't be long after this delay. At this time Canning had a new idea. Your Majesty Prime Minister, maybe we can treat others the same way they do. Robert Peel. Mr. Canning, you mean we can also, like the Austrians, transport our British weapons to the mountains of northern Albania and let the Austrians have a taste of what we experienced in Afghanistan. This immediately caused discomfort among a certain cabinet member who happened to have returned from British India. This resolution still caused dissatisfaction among some people. That is it worth the waste of time and money? Will the Austrian Navy challenge the Royal Navy's maritime supremacy? For now, the conflict between Austria and Britain is far from irreconcilable. France and Russia obviously pose a greater threat to the latter than the former in today's difficult diplomatic situation. Why do you spare no effort to suppress an existence that may not threaten Britain at all? This inevitably makes people speculate that Viscount Stratford is seeking public revenge, which is even more irritating than the previous involvement of Britain in the Far Eastern War by Palmerston. Viscount Stratford refers to Stratford Canning. You must know that after that war, Britain did not get the rewards Palmerston promised. At this time, Viscount Stratford was pushing the British Empire into another abyss. There were many people in the Tory party who were dissatisfied with Canning, but Robert Peel displayed the characteristics of an excellent leader at this time. He was trustworthy in employing people and adopted the former's proposal against all odds. So a large number of British weapons were shipped to Albania, and then they discovered a problem. Although there are many roads into the mountains, there is no road that allows these weapons To enter Austria's ruled areas. Austria's control over the mountainous areas of northern Albania is far stronger than the British imagined, and the complexity of the mountainous areas of northern Albania is far beyond their imagination. Eventually, most of these weapons flowed back to the British-occupied southern Albania. And the Austrians also made the British supply of weapons to the rebels public. Of course, Majid is not stupid, and his approach is to continue the investigation. Chapter 616 about Albania. Compared to Albania, the Indian subcontinent was obviously much more important. At this time, the British government had not received news of Afghanistan's invasion of the Khalid. Robert Peel only knew that Henry Harding's progress was slow. Although the latter claimed to be making steady progress, the members of Congress and the financial backers behind them obviously did not buy it. What those people want is a broader market, more sources of raw materials, and higher profits. So Robert Peel decided to send some more men to help Sir Henry Harding speed up, and also to warn Austria. Austria increased its troops by 3,000. And Britain increased its troops by 5,000. But if Robert Peel knew what was happening in the Indian subcontinent at this time, he would have added 30,000 troops. The Sikh Empire did not surrender, and the Afghan invasion forced Sir Henry Harding to mobilize more troops. As a result, the rear was unstable, and attracted a group of sharks that smelled blood, including Persia and Oman. Of course, the former is just a thought, while the latter is really ready to take action, because Oman actually controls Gwadar, and they can use it as a base to start a battle against India. It's just that Emperor said was a little scared by the Austrians. He didn't want to make the same mistake again, and decided to wait and see. At the same time, something even more unfavorable to the British happened. Afghanistan and the Sikh Empire settled their differences and formed an alliance to fight against the British. It has to be said that Akbar Khan's personal ability is indeed outstanding. He defied all opinions and formed an alliance with the feuding Sikhs, which completely exceeded the expectations of the British. In fact, before this, Henry Harding was still studying how to make the Afghans and Sikhs fight among themselves, and then the British would benefit. However, as the world's #1 troublemaker, even if the opponent forms an alliance first, he still has to stir things up. After Austria added 3,000 troops, Tranqueba's total strength reached 7,000, including 5,000 Austrian troops, 500 Danish mercenaries, and about 1,500 local troops, although the increase in troops was nominally 3,000. In fact, in addition to the army, there were also a large number of craftsmen, officials and missionaries. Religion may not be useful against the great powers in those countries with strong national self-confidence, but it is really useful for the early civilizations of the colonies, especially the Austrian Catholic Church, which has accumulated rich experience in MLM organizations. Under Franz's transformation, they have learned how to adapt to local conditions, do as the locals do, and flexibly practice religion. Compared to sending troops to conquer India, Franz felt that religious victory was easier, and because of the relationship between Hinduism and the caste system, it was naturally suitable for Austrians to preach. Of course, if some missionaries were unfortunately martyred, Austria would have even more reason to send troops and demand compensation. Catholicism, like many early religions, has strong control over the grassroots, and it is easy for them to form a special political force to influence the situation. In this regard, Protestantism is much worse. Their spread speed and control over primitive civilization are far inferior to the former. The prosperity of the Austrian Church made the Prussian Church very unhappy. In 1845, the Prussian Church hoped to transform the Church like Austria and turn it into a subordinate institution of the state. At that time, the Prussian Church worked closely with the government, which issued pastoral qualification certificates, stipulated educational content, and managed church property. This official church model was widespread in Europe in the 19th century and was called the state church system. The Prussian Church is obviously not willing to do this. Some believers and pastors are calling for self-reform of the church, such as improving the quality of education and improving the treatment of pastors at the same time. Some religious leaders promoted Catholic teachings and traditional theological views in the fields of education, society, and politics. They especially like to compare their next door neighbors, Austria, which made King Frederick William IV of Prussia particularly unhappy. However, the reality is that the Prussian Protestant Church has been unable to escape the control of the state in the process of modernization. Coupled with a continuous religious reform, and without a colony to increase the number of believers, it has increasingly lost its original political and social status and independence. Even if the churches want to prevent this from happening, they cannot escape the role of political appendages in the end. The church's dissatisfaction was only blown away by Frederick William IV. As a result, some aspiring majesticks have targeted Austria, a country that can flexibly practice religion, and are ready to make great achievements. Russia in the north was unexpectedly calm after learning about the competition between Britain and Austria in Albania. It did not rush to express its position, but instead observed the development of the situation. In fact, this is not because Russia has become smarter, but because the intensity of the war in the Caucasus is much higher than the same period in history, and that Tsar really has no time to deal with Albania's affairs. That Tsar's delay in taking a stand made others embarrassed. Austria and Britain began to quarrel, and the Ottoman Empire took longer to investigate. California. Fremont was still a little dissatisfied before seeing Friedrich's fleet, because after Austria incorporated this huge fleet of nearly 70 warships, they actually changed those warships into fishing boats and cargo ships. This was an insult to the Americans who surrendered. Although those warships were originally converted from fishing boats and cargo ships, it was still the place where they had fought. In fact, this is also a helpless move. It is not a problem to support tens of thousands of navies with the wealth of California, but these navies cannot all be Americans. Franz didn't believe that the descendants of the British could stay peaceful forever, so when he first collected these fleets, he diluted them with sand. Afterwards, he adapted and reorganized them, and finally reduced the number of Americans to below 40%. It's just that these people are still proud. They feel that the Austrian Empire's navy is not good enough. Not only California, but even the entire Austrian Empire needs them as a front. However, this pride was shattered when Friedrich's fleet arrived. Because those huge battleships were not comparable to the California fleet at all. The largest flagship in Fremont's hands at this time was only 2,100 tons, and the smallest of the 10 new steam battleships brought by Friedrich was also 4,500 tons as the flagship. The Prinz Eugen is a monster of nearly 7,000 tons. In front of these behemoths, the battleships of less than 1,000 tons in the California fleet looked particularly petite and cute. At the same time, the regular army of the Austrian Empire also left a deep impression on Fremont. The latter had previously thought that the Austrian army that defeated Robert Stockton must be the most elite force in Austria. However, when the Austrian navy led by Archduke Friedrich disembarked, these surrendering American troops felt a sense of inferiority. This was naturally done intentionally by Franz, and his purpose was naturally to knock down the mountain and shock the tiger. Chapter 617. Gold. Hey, what is this? Gold, yellow, shining, precious gold. No, gods, I'm not an idol believer. I only want you to give me some roots. This thing, just a little bit, can turn black into white, ugly into beautiful, wrong into right, humble into noble, old into young, coward into brave. Shakespeare's Timon of Athens. The charm of money is indeed unstoppable. Even after the war, California's population is still growing explosively. From 450,000 before the war to 500,000, growing at a rapid rate of 10% per year. How fast is this? Take India, which is well known to modern people, as an example. Its population growth rate is only 0.8%, while the current California area is 12.5 times that point. If it develops at this rate, California will have a population of 3.7 million in 20 years, but that is almost impossible, because the gold mines will run out sooner or later. Without gold, this land will no longer have such great charm. Although the alchemy technology of the Austrian Empire at this time was far beyond the level of the same period in history, and the utilization rate was also constantly improving, it is an indisputable fact that gold mines are non-renewable resources. Moreover, in the future, the land managed by OMA United Development Company will not be limited to California. In fact, France is currently studying how to develop land in Nevada Point. However, unlike California's beautiful natural environment, Nevada's climate is hot and arid, with high temperatures in summer and cold winters, which can be described as two distinct seasons. Nevada's terrain is complex and diverse, including mountains, deserts, plateaus, basins, and canyons. In addition to the common wild wolves and black bears, local creatures also include the Nevada brown spider and the Nevada burnt-tailed scorpion, which are unique local products, not to mention the mysterious Bigfoot and brain-eating insects. If the United States hadn't conducted hundreds of nuclear tests in Nevada in later generations, God knows what kind of monsters could be found in at Point. The local Shoshone people said that Chernobyl was weaker than anything else, and the nuclear radiation the local area endured was 48 times that of Hiroshima. Point. Franz was naturally unwilling to waste precious German immigrants by colonizing such a poor place. In fact, the Indians are the most suitable for the local area and have the highest adaptability point, but these guys are weak in both development and resource exploration. In addition, there is a very high chance of rebellion, or even uniting with local Indians and Americans to attack the Omex Joint Development Company. Point. Therefore, France needed a group of loyal and reliable and hard-working colonial advance teams. This is not just for California's sake. In fact, Austria's colonies are still very short of people. Point. After all, the Irish have been enslaved by the British for a long time, and it is inevitable that some crazy people will emerge. The colony can have Irish people, but the proportion should not be too high, let alone allow it to become a large gathering place. Point. In fact, the United States encountered many problems when assimilating the Irish, one of which was the large number of gangs and mobs. Later generations only knew about the Italian mafia in black clothes and black hats holding Thompson, but they did not know about the Irish gangsters who were countless times more terrifying. Point. Although the Italian mafia can easily defeat the Irish in terms of professional skills, the latter has stronger concealment and more ambitious goals than the former. In fact, you can put it in a simpler way, that is, the Italian mafia cares about money, while the Irish mafia cares more about power. While the Italians were still bleeding in the streets, the Irish had quietly mastered a more effective weapon, power, with the rapid development of urbanization. In the United States, no president can keep up with the infrastructure and management system. Point. This created a large power vacuum, and Irish gangs spontaneously became the underground bosses of these emerging cities. Historically, it was called U-boss, literally translated as underground boss, but Franz felt that it would be more appropriate to translate it into underground mayor. This is well reflected in the American TV series The Mayor of Kingston starring Hawkeye Street, Zelly and Corky. Although the plot is very hot, it is still a story about Huang Shilling's whitewashing, and even the whitewashing story, I don't even bother to wash it, but I just tell you that this is how the world should be. Point. This political gang seems to have alleviated local conflicts to a certain extent, and established an order suitable for the local area. Point. However, these guys have nothing to do with good people, because they themselves are the source of chaos. Although the Irish people during the Great Famine were very pitiful, it would be okay if Franz exchanged the safety and happiness of his people for it. After all, indifference in this world can solve 99% of the problems. Do not copy them, but believe that the world is beautiful and the future is bright. In fact, apart from Franz looking for labor, Americans are not idle either. Historically, in 1845, Asa Whitney proposed to the US Congress to build a railroad across the North American continent. So many American elites discuss building a railroad. Point. But now that the Mexican-American War had failed, and California and Nevada were no longer in American hands, Franz felt that certain things might never happen again. Point. But the reality is that Americans still intend to build a transcontinental railway, but it will no longer pass through Nevada and California, but directly to Oregon. Point. The reason is very strange. That is, the American whaling industry needs this railway, and at the same time, more than 100,000 Americans are blocked from colonization by less than 2,000 British people. This is really unbearable. Point. The two main slogans of James Polk's presidential campaign were to fight slavery and retake Oregon. Point. He always showed himself as a tough guy, and even said to the British, if we want 49 degrees north latitude, we still need war. Although The United States won the Mexican-American War. The losses were incredibly high, and as the army was disbanded, yellow fever began to spread across the country, killing too many people. To counterpoint, the army of the northern factory owners was completely defeated in the war. On the other hand, the army of the southern slave owners did not suffer much losses, because they were always on guard against the French. As a result of this ebb and flow, the voice of the southern slave owners became stronger, and some even claimed that they had invited the French so that the United States could turn the crisis around. However, there is a lot of controversy on this point, because the generals of the Northern Army insist that Austria and Mexico are at the end of their war effort, and the United States can achieve final victory without the French, and there is no need to give away half of the fruits of victory. Both sides hold their own opinions, but one thing is certain, that is, the power of the South was stronger at this time, so Polk would never dare to initiate slavery. Historically, Polk did not point his finger at slavery itself, although Democrats have always claimed. James Polk was a lifelong fighter for democracy and freedom, a capable, honest man who could not be bought, but in reality he always wanted them to be young, effective and cheap. Chapter 618 Pay off the debt. James Polk continued to purchase more and younger slaves while claiming to free them. But as a public figure, he was not stupid enough to buy slaves himself. All this was done by his wife, Sarah Polk, and the secret slave trade continued until James Polk's death. Polk himself believed that treating slaves as chattel was morally correct, but this was not in line with the mainstream view at the time, so he could only purchase slaves in secret. James Polk never purchased slaves. Those transactions were simply to keep his family together. As far as slaves were concerned, Polk preferred those who were young and efficient, especially those girls who can create more value in their lives. Every child born to slaves will be part of my property. From a letter written by Polk to his cousin. In addition, the proportion of children in Polk's secret transactions was quite high, accounting for almost 60% of all transactions, which was considered a very discerning practice at the time. Because child slaves are cheaper and have a longer use life, some American economists even called them great investors in history. Although some jokes often say that slaves in manors live better than slaves in factories, as far as minors are concerned, the mortality rate of minor slaves in manors is 45%, while the national minor mortality rate is only 20%. That is to say, nearly half of the slaves in the United States did not survive to adulthood, while 3/4 of ordinary Americans did. The mortality rate of underage slaves in Polk's manor was 55%. This was mainly due to his wife's focus on breeding more slaves to obtain more profits, causing those teenagers to endure hardships that should not have been experienced at their age. If Polk did not move toward slavery, he would have no choice but to attack the British. But with the national strength of the United States at this time, it is also impossible to do this. After all, the United States at this time had offended Austria and was in competition with the French. The only stable market for cotton was the British. In fact, Austria had its own cotton fields, and the French also built a large number of cotton plantations in their North American colonies. Not only were the models similar to those of the Americans, but even the black slaves and overseers were brought from the United States. Therefore, in order to ensure the sales of American cotton, the British Polk did not dare to offend. In fact, even without the above, the military and national power of the United States cannot be compared with that of the United Kingdom. However, although the US military performed poorly in the previous US-Mexico war, everyone from generals to politicians still looked arrogant, as if those failures had never happened. As for the reflection on this war, there was almost no reflection. Robert E. Lee was thrown tomatoes by students because he lectured on the lessons of the failure at the Battle of the Rio Grande in class at West Point Military Academy. After the war, the US military was disbanded in large numbers. These people were originally young and strong laborers, but because many of them were infected or carried yellow fever bacteria, a yellow fever epidemic spread across the United States. The result is that these soldiers who just fought for the United States have become poisonous rats that everyone beats. The reason for this result is related to the way the US government resettled the soldiers. The government hoped that the soldiers could stay in the land they had just obtained and settle nearby, which would also save the time of immigration point, but these soldiers were generally poor, and their income could not cover the cost of purchasing land. But if it can be placed on the newly acquired land, it will not only save the expense of disbanding soldiers, but also stabilize the border. It is definitely the best of both worlds. While senior White House officials were hesitating, bankers headed by Soros came to the White House. They came here for no other reason than to collect accounts specifically. There are 3 points. First, restore the independent treasury system. Point second, reduce tariffs. Third, manage the Western region. Point the first point is what bankers and Jewish financial groups value most, although in theory the establishment of an independent treasury system will separate the government from banking operations and prevent certain interest groups and individuals from using banks to make profits. It will, even in turn, hit the banking industry, reduce the use of bankrolls, and hinder the interests of certain interest groups. But in fact, this system is more likely to breed corruption, and the independent treasury of the United States has never been independent. Point instead, it evolved into a currency issuing bank, a national silver coin reserve center, a gold and exchange rate control center, replacing the central bank to a certain extent, and eventually established the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Becoming the prototype of the current Federal Reserve. Point this was discussed before Polk came to power, so he had no objections. However, the list of treasury officials made him frown, because almost all of them were Jews. The reputation of Jews in this era is really not good. If this list of official appointment and dismissal is revealed, I'm afraid that he will not be the president. There are too many Jews on this list. Soros smiled. Mr. President, they are not Jews. They are just American citizens. In fact, except for some special surnames, ordinary people have no way of judging whether those officials are Jewish. Point Polk. Mr. Soros, your wisdom is really admirable. It is true that the value of a citizen cannot be defined by his racial identity. It depends on what he has done for the country. Soros, I also admire your wit and profound sense of justice. Everyone respects the great America. To our America, the richest plutocrats in the United States raised a toast together. As for the second point of lowering tariffs, it is part of the deal between Soros and Franz. However, I have to say that these businessmen are sometimes very trustworthy. Of course, this may also have something to do with the gun in Franz's hand. Point Polk actually did not advocate lowering tariffs, because the American industry was in its infancy and needed a large amount of cheap raw materials, cheap labor, and a stable market. Point however, once tariffs are lifted, a large number of European industrial products will flow into the market. At the same time, a large number of foreign orders will rob the raw materials on which American domestic industries depend. What's more, some European powers will attract immigrants in the opposite direction, leading to a brain drain. Point this is what Polk did not want to see, but his personal will is not worth mentioning in the face of power. In fact, the tariff issue has been around for a long time, but at this time the South was strong, and coupled with the collective pressure from bankers, even Vice President Joel Dallas, who had always opposed lowering tariffs, surrendered. Point in the end, Polk instituted the lowest tariffs in US history. US cotton and grain exports had almost zero tariffs. Similarly, European industrial product imports also had almost zero tariffs. Austria's high-end industrial products even received US official symbolic of subsidies. The third point is that in addition to those powers and false reputations, bankers also need to recover their costs. The land in the West is just right. After all, this is the legal income of the US government, which is perfect for repaying debts, but the resettlement of veterans is not under their control. If they want land, they can just buy it with money. Point you get what you pay for. That's fair enough. Point as for those soldiers who can't afford it, what should they do? But there's always someone who can afford it, right? Please ask for monthly passes, recommendation votes, etc. Chapter 619 Brothers. Franz had already expected that the US government would kill the donkey, but he was somewhat powerless. Theoretically speaking, the Austrian Empire can take advantage of the opportunity to do many things, but the reality is that it is unrealistic to carry out micromanagement across the Atlantic Ocean point at the same time. Due to the existence of the Nevada Desert, it is unrealistic for France to attract traffic on a macro scale. After all, this journey is too difficult point, but France still underestimated the charm of gold and the misery experienced by those American retired veterans. The intelligence agency sent simply spread some rumors about California gold, coupled with some recruitment notices from the OM United Development Company, which had already driven many desperate American veterans into madness, and some Austrian agents pretended to be snakeheads, which made those Americans regard them as saviors. A smuggler is a person who specializes in organizing illegal immigration and making money from it. Relative to the word human snake, human snake refers specifically to people who sneak into foreign countries. They do not dare to go through normal channels, but only dare to move along rugged mountain roads or under the cover of darkness, so they are called human snakes. In fact, the journey to California is very dangerous, because in order to prevent American infiltration tactics, Austria once raised a large number of bounty hunters and headhunters as O/U-0,026M grew. Legal California citizenship became increasingly difficult to obtain. Therefore, in the eyes of Californians at this time, those stowaways were not human beings but moving money. However, hunting stowaways was not the only way to obtain legal citizenship. In fact, California's system was designed by Franz himself, so it's just a matter of time that there are many roads. However, they don't dare to kill anyone. For example, when they meet a team led by Austrian agents, they will be as friendly as possible. After all, the former rely on absolute violence to gain a foothold in this Wild West. Therefore, Americans who arrive in California have two completely opposite attitudes when writing letters to relatives and friends back home. One is that California is simply a paradise on earth. Although the journey is difficult, the people on the road are very friendly, and there are some stations where you can get supplies at very low prices. The other feels that this place is simply a hell on earth, with harsh deserts, poisonous insects and beasts that often appear, and even cannibals and bounty hunters. Although the reputation is not very good, there are still many people who are willing to take risks. But this kind of spontaneous small-scale immigration cannot attract the attention of the US government. In fact, the United States at this time has indeed been actively attracting immigrants, but what they want are high-quality craftsmen, scholars, engineers, bankers and the like, not rough guys who don't know anything. And the people who want to go to California to fight for a future happen to be the old roundnecks who are not favored by others. So not only the US government, but also the mainstream public opinion does not discuss these matters. Although California has undergone almost earth-shaking changes in recent years, it is still a poor place in Friedrich's eyes. In order to prevent his arrogant brother from offending the entire upper class in California, Archduke Karl Ferdinand took him directly to his estate. But in fact, Archduke Ferdinand was overly worried, because no one dared to be dissatisfied. No matter how rampant Archduke Friedrich was, Archduke Karl Ferdinand's thunderous methods had previously shocked those people. When he saw the main force of the Austrian Imperial Navy, what he felt was not only shock, but despair-born. When the strength difference reached a certain level point, because these two brothers can really kill all the factions in the California area, and those giant ships and cannons are completely beyond the latter's imagination. This is partly due to Franz's selection and design of the colors of the military uniforms. The uniforms of the Austrian Marine Corps are different from the Army's dark grey, but use an older black and white color scheme. White military uniforms have always been an Austrian tradition, but due to the decline in national strength during the empire, white cloth could not be purchased. It was also considered a part of the Austrian Empire's military technological progress. The military firmly claimed that dark grey military uniforms were more conducive to concealment, but in fact the mainstream tactics of both sides at that time were still lining up to shoot and adding skirmishers. In fact, according to Austrian tradition, the trousers of the German regiment are white, and the trousers of the Hungarian regiment are blue. However, in order to reflect the inclusiveness of the Austrian Empire at this time, the color of the pants was uniformly black. Although Franz doesn't know much about fashion design, He knows that black and white are timeless classics. In fact, the combination of black and white tones is very coordinated and not monotonous. It can not only show a simple yet elegant beauty, but can even give people a mysterious and unique feeling point. Although animals with black and white colors are unusual, such as pandas, penguins, huskies, and killer whales in the ocean, people with black and white colors often give people the feeling of thugs in suits. Killer whales have a high IQ, but that doesn't mean they are normal. They have to do a lot of things like jacking turtles, photographing seals, and catching birds. Especially for a fish who can catch birds, it's simply not his job. Back to the main story. Because Franz invited many masters to design Austrian military uniforms, they were particularly beautiful in terms of aesthetics, but when thousands of people move in unison, it gives people not only a sense of beauty, but also a breathtaking momentum point. Don't worry about whether you can fight or not, but you have already won in terms of momentum point. The only drawback is that the M42 helmets on the heads of the soldiers and the yellow rubber shoes on their feet look a bit ridiculous, especially the pod helmets that can be used as rice cookers by wearing iron wire, which makes people feel a bit funny. The yellow rubber shoes on the feet made those North American country bumpkins very curious. After all, they had never seen rubber shoes before. This is not because vulcanized rubber technology is difficult to master, but because Austria controls more than 95% of the world's rubber trade at this time. In short, the Austrian Imperial Navy's first appearance in California was very successful. Friedrich, you are the marshal of the empire after all. Why are you still so arrogant, Ferdinand? It's not like you to be so weak. The conversation between the two brothers after they met was not harmonious because their personalities were exactly opposite. Friedrich was very flamboyant, while Ferdinand was the calmest of the brothers. That's why Franz chose the latter to come to California as a governor. After all, son says young, frivolous and unprepared character is not suitable for this kind of murderous Western world. Similarly, if the Austrian Imperial Navy wants to survive in the cracks and carve out its own world, in addition to the accumulation of technology and materials, it also needs a commander who dares to fight and fight. Ferdinand, with all this mobilization of troops, is there gold on that Hawaiian island? Friedrich, are you crazy about mining? Do you think gold is like an apple in the ground? Can it grow if you plant it? Austrians call potatoes apples of the field. As an older brother, it was really unpleasant to be criticized like this by his younger brother. However, Ferdinand did not have the majesty of his elder brother Albrecht, so he could only continue to complain. Which genius came up with the plan? What if your fleet is overturned by a wave? Isn't the empire's investment for so many years in vain? Ferdinand's ignorance of navigation also annoyed Friedrich. In fact, larger ships during this period were relatively difficult to sink. In particular, the performance of warships in all aspects far exceeds that of cargo ships. There are many battleships that have sunk in storms in history, but very few of them exceed 2,000 tons. This time Friedrich brought all big ships with over 4,000 tons. These iron sheet ships were not only sturdier than previous ships, but also more powerful. As long as they were operated properly, it was difficult to capsize. Our future emperor, I think he is a genius. What do you think? There was a strong smell of gunpowder in Friedrich's words, especially his arrogant attitude. In addition, what do you think? This sentence simply made Archduke Ferdinand very angry. But the fact that Franz was the future emperor had already been decided within the royal family. He didn't want to bet on whether Friedrich, an unlucky boy, would make a fuss about what he said, so he had no choice but to say, "But what does this genius want to do? I heard that Hawaii is the territory of the British. Do you want to go to war?" "That's not true," Friedrich replied calmly. "He wants me to help people seek justice and rent a dock or something. Then it's not like we have to mobilize so many troops." "Ah, you prepared? What if a wave capsizes the boat like you said?" Friedrich continued to speak in a sinister manner, which made Ferdinand even more unhappy. After all, the latter was the one who spoke the truth in California. "Oh, you annoying dwarf. Can't you speak normally? I'm getting married." "Who are you lying to? You guys have never even touched a woman. Do you want to marry your boat? Damn it, you just married a boat." I have a fiancé who is on my boat. Oh. No. Is there a woman in that dirty, smelly cabin? She must be a witch who likes to eat frog legs and bad wings. Your wife is the witch who likes to eat frog legs and bad wings. The deck of my ship is so bright that it can be used as a mirror. And my wife is the princess of the Oman Empire. Princess Aman. Isn't that a Cheyenne Fang religious country? Will my father and family agree? What's the objection? Have you forgotten that your mother is also a pagan? And how can anyone object to something that is beneficial to the family? Mother is a heretic, not a heretic. Archduke Ferdinand corrected point. In fact, marriage is not unfamiliar to members of the Habsburg family. After all, the family motto is let others fight. You, lucky Austria, get married. What the god of war can bestow on you, the god of love, I can also give it to you. At this time, Archduke Ferdinand was conjuring up the image of the Cheyenne Fang princess, but this image was not a positive one. After all, Austria and the Arab world had been enemies for decades, and that stereotype was lingering. Soon the image of an Arab wrapped in white cloth and covered with black gauze, holding a scimitar in one hand and poison in the other, while chanting strange scriptures appeared in his mind. Then Archduke Ferdinand patted his brother on the shoulder and said in a meaningful tone, "Thank you so much for sacrificing so much for your family and empire. It's not hard." At this time, Friedrich smelled a special fragrance and said, "Huh, she seems to be following here, and she won't let you see her. Sneaker. Come in." Archduke Ferdinand was shocked when he heard this. He immediately reached for the pistol at his waist, ready to fight against any monster that might appear at any time. But no monster appeared. Only a woman in luxurious clothes slowly walked over, and the gold and silver ornaments used for makeup made a pleasant sound. At first glance, one cannot believe that she comes from a desert country with her clean and fair skin, and her face is a combination of exquisiteness unique to Easterners. There was no scimitar and no mask, which made Ferdinand very confused. Afterwards, Princess Sinica greeted the former in fluent French, and Ferdinand responded with an awkward smile. "Is she Arab? Why doesn't she look like her?" Ferdinand whispered to his brother, who was also embarrassed. "She has Dutch, Portuguese, and Italian ancestry, and maybe some Eastern European ancestry. Then, is she a real princess?" Archduke Ferdinand's doubts are actually normal, because in Europe there is a problem of intermarriage between nobles and common people. If one parent is not a noble, or has a relatively low status, the children cannot obtain the corresponding status, especially for the royal family. The purity of bloodline is very important. Don't worry, Franz has investigated that this is a real princess, and according to him, even if Sneaker is not a princess, as long as she marries me, the Sultan of Oman will have to recognize her as a princess. In fact, Franz only thought that the princess was a pawn used by said to make a marriage. Since Friedrich liked it, and it was indeed beneficial to the Austrian Empire, he was naturally willing to match her. In fact, Franz has also conducted a detailed investigation. Princess Sneaker has a very upright background. Her previous behavior in Vienna was just wandering around with the Grand Duchess Carolina. She seemed to be just a golden girl raised in a boudoir Canary Point. Since her bloodline is relatively far away from the European royal family, Franz is still very optimistic that this princess can add several healthy new members to the Habsburg family. It's just that Princess Sneaker is not as simple as Franz imagined. The former has never forgotten her mission. The first time I met my brother and sister, Ferdinand, the older brother, still had to express his feelings, so he gave Sinica some California specialty, 200 kilograms of gold sand, equivalent to 285,000 florins. Even the Princess of Oman was a little surprised by such an expensive gift, but what she didn't know was that the box of jewelry that Carolina and Albrecht gave her before was more valuable than the gold sand in front of her, and when she saw it in the Albina Palace, the paintings used for decoration are even more expensive. Afterwards, Ferdinand met Kagura again, and he had some impressions of this Japanese girl. After all, there were not many Asians in Austria. Ferdinand looked at Friedrich with questioning eyes, and the latter's answer made the former even more stunned. Archduke Franz plans to colonize her hometown, so she naturally needs a leading party. Chapter 621 Arrival in Hawaii. At this time, the government of the Kingdom of Hawaii was a gathering of stars. The Minister of Justice, John Ricord, was a New Jersey native from the United States, and the Secretary of Finance, Gerard Judd, was a French missionary. William Cherralize, the ambassador to France, Britain, and the United States, was a British captain, and Robert Wiley, the Foreign Secretary, was a Scottish doctor. In addition, many local officials are held by foreigners. The reason for this situation is entirely due to the consular jurisdiction. A large number of foreigners acting recklessly on Hawaii Island have aroused great dissatisfaction among the people. However, due to the existence of consular jurisdiction, the indigenous officials are helpless to deal with the foreigners who have committed crimes. However, this did not satisfy those businessmen. They kept filing lawsuits against the Hawaiian government, demanding more and more excessive conditions. Kamehameha III once tried to refuse, but this soon attracted the patronage of the armies of the great powers, and neither the British nor the French could be dealt with by the Hawaiians, so the Hawaiian version of using barbarians to control barbarians was launched. Kamehameha III decided to use foreigners to manage the country, so that those businessmen would not dare to act recklessly. Under the guidance of this strange thinking, the new Hawaiian government came into being, which to a certain extent, has indeed reduced the number of strange lawsuits filed by foreign businessmen. But what followed was a frantic influx of businessmen into the government, and Kamehameha III was almost eliminated. Thomas Fanuel was one of them at this time, but due to changes in history, Americans did not have the power, let alone the energy, to take care of the indigenous people on a small island. So he wrote a letter to the Austrian Imperial government with the attitude of giving it a try. To Thomas Fanuel's surprise, he actually got a reply from the other party. However, Thomas Fanuel did not actually have much expectations for how much help Austria, thousands of miles away, could provide. But when the Austrian fleet came into the harbor, he was completely shocked. The Fanuel couple and their eldest daughter were bewildered and waved their homemade flags, while the surrounding aborigines had already fled in fear. Although this is not the first time Westerners have visited Hawaii Island, it is the first time they have seen a real naval fleet. Although the previous British battleship Callista Ford was only 1,200 tons, it was still the largest battleship the locals had ever seen. The tonnage of this ship is only 1/6 that of Friedrich's flagship Prince Eugen steam ironclad. Not to mention the black smoke belching chimneys in the ironclad hull. Only the youngest son of the Fanuel couple was jumping up and down and waving the small flag in his hand, as if he had discovered some treasure. At the same time, the Nanming merchants who had been dormant on Hawaii Island also started taking action. They had arrived here long ago and established their own power. However, they were never recognized by the white people because of their skin color. Sandalwood is very common in Hawaii, where the local indigenous people even use it as firewood, but it is a very valuable commodity in the Far East. Of course, the Nanming area is no exception, but the purpose of these Nanming businessmen is not just for sandalwood, but to cooperate with Austria's actions. This was part of the agreement between Franz and Zhu Qiangying. Many years ago, Nanming could gain huge profits from the sandalwood trade, while the Austrian side needed Nanming's labor to build a dock city for it. This was a win-win deal. It's just that Kamehameha III's head hurt even more in the Hawaiian palace. From the panic of his men, he knew that this time there was a big trouble. Of course, Kamehameha III had no good way to deal with this situation. Since he couldn't resist, he could only accept it, but it was still necessary to find a comfortable position for himself. However, Kamehameha III was still startled when he came to the king's balcony. In his own words, he described it as a huge black beast with demons that were constantly flashing light pouring out. Flash is mainly a problem of helmets reflecting light. In this era, matte treatment is still a waste of money, so Franz did not do that. If necessary, the military also issued matching hemp rope for camouflage and concealment. Kamehameha III looked even worse than the previous messenger, but he did not fall down with the help of Queen Kalamaha Kalalaboni Kapakahale. Oh my god. Oh my god. What a monster that is. The queen also sighed with emotion. It seems that we can't escape this time. With so many people, even the men from all the tribes on the island can't defeat them. On the other hand, Friedrich was a little worried. That is, Thomas Faneuil's power was much weaker than Franz expected. There were only about 30 people in the family plus a few helpers, apprentices, bodyguards, and servants, but Friedrich still listened patiently to Mr. Faneuil's trembling explanation of the matter. Basically, it is the story of the Faneuil family who had no backers, but were maliciously squeezed out by British and French businessmen. Taking advantage of the Hawaiians, Thomas Faneuil was a high-end coffee merchant. The new varieties he finally cultivated were subleased to others by the indigenous people. Although there are British and French businessmen behind this matter, there are really not many Westerners who can be bullied by the indigenous people in this era. In fact, the origin of these things must be blamed on Kamehameha III. When the British first occupied Hawaii, the king wanted to prevent the entire country from becoming a subsidiary of the British. After studying Western law, he came to the conclusion that the only way to prevent Hawaii from being annexed by foreign powers was to distribute the land to the people. Because as long as the land does not belong to the king, the great powers can no longer force him to cede the land, and buying small pieces of land costs a lot of money, which is obviously not in the interests of the great powers. So Kamehameha III distributed the land to his people, but the indigenous people at that time did not have a deep concept of land. First, Faneuil contracted a large area of land for coffee cultivation at a very low price, and then several foreign businessmen offered a relatively high price for the indigenous people to sublease the land to them. But in fact, the price of the latter was still unimaginably low. The indigenous people wanted to get their land back and sell it at a higher price, but the British and French businessmen had consular jurisdiction, so they had no choice but to admit defeat. Now Fana has no choice but to get his land back, and he is unable to get compensation from those who broke the agreement. The British and French consuls knew about the Austrian Empire's fleet when it first entered the port, and they were standing next to Friedrich. With respectful smiles on their faces, the latter glanced back, and the two consuls said immediately, "Please, rest assured, His Highness the Grand Duke, we will definitely deal with it impartially, and will never protect those who harm the relationship between the two countries." Friedrich waved his hand to indicate that there were too many people in the room, and asked the soldiers to go out first. After the soldiers left the house, the remaining 3 people let out a sigh of relief at the same time. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 621. Take a piece of the pie. Out of respect for the Hawaiian royal family, Friedrich chose to visit the palace. In fact, Kamehameha III waited outside the temporary camp of the Austrian army for a long time, but he was politely invited back by the Austrian diplomats when Friedrich's team arrived in front of the Hawaiian palace. Kamehameha III and the Queen had been waiting at the door for a long time. After a brief and solemn ceremony, Friedrich arrived at the palace, accompanied by a team of guards and 2 diplomats. First, diplomatic relations were established in a routine manner, and then Friedrich got straight to the point and talked about FANA. The 30-year land development agreement signed between our businessmen and your subjects has just been in the past 2 years. Your subjects have subleased the land to others and refused to compensate. I hope you can exercise the power in your hands fairly. Kamehameha III was stunned. He did not expect that the common people in his country were so fierce. They dared to set traps for people whom he did not dare to offend. Well, in order to show my friendship to the Austrian Empire, I, Kamehameha III, officially grant your country consular jurisdiction on Hawaiian soil. What do you think, Friedrich? And the other 2 diplomats were confused. They actually thought of a bunch of ways to make him submit. It seemed that the other party was familiar with the road and willing to cooperate, which seemed to save a lot of trouble. The entire negotiation was within Franz's plan. A slap in the face would give him a sweet date, so as to form a virtuous circle. The Austrian Empire immediately proposed the development of Pearl Harbor, which was located on the island of Hua, and was named after its abundant pearls. It's just that the fishing efficiency of fishermen is too low, and King Kamehameha III cannot benefit from it due to the special circumstances of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So, when the Austrians made this suggestion, Kamehameha III's eyes immediately lit up, because the financial situation of the Hawaiian kingdom was really poor, especially after the land was distributed to the people. The country's tax revenue almost collapsed. Almost all government revenue came from taxes on the royal family's own land and ports. Franz targeted this weakness. The financial revenue of the entire kingdom of Hawaii was less than $50,000, and the annual turnover of the Hawaiian pearl trade was more than $150,000. How could this not make Kamehameha III jealous? The Austrian Empire promised that, as long as the latter contracted Pearl Bay, the former would get a profit of $50,000 per year without spending a penny. That would double the national finances. Kamehameha III immediately grabbed Friedrich's hand with red eyes and wanted to kneel down and worship him. You must know that mining pearls in this era requires a lot of manpower, and in order to protect your own interests and prevent others from illegally mining, this is not a small expense. Then there is the transportation and sale of pearls. Hawaiians cannot afford these things. The reality is that everyone can dig them themselves, so who will buy them? Since Hawaii is a small country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, if you want to sell it, you must cross the vast ocean. This was almost impossible in the eyes of the Hawaiians at that time. In fact, when the Europeans first came across the ocean, the local indigenous people regarded it as a god. Moreover, maritime transportation has a long period of cyclicality and uncertainty. If the ship capsizes, you will lose all your money, or if the market is not good, you will lose everything. These risks were unbearable by Kamehameha III and any Hawaiian. If his advisors had not explained it to him, he would not even have known that those small pearls could sell for such high prices on the other side of the ocean. Therefore, Kamehameha III was very satisfied with the Austrian side's proposal at this time, and even felt a little guilty, but this emotion soon disappeared, because the Austrian side put forward new conditions. The Austrian Empire wanted to nominate a customs general, and Franz, like other Westerners, needed a share of Hawaii's government. Although the position of the General Director of Customs is much weaker than the positions of the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Justice in terms of power, in a primitive government like the Kingdom of Hawaii, the General Director of Customs does not have a small say. Of course, the great powers at this time had not noticed this, and Kamehameha III readily agreed to this seemingly insignificant position. At this time, Kamehameha III could not imagine that the future of his kingdom would depend on this institution. As for the development of Pearl Bay, pearl fishing was just a cover. Franz's purpose was to control Pearl Harbor, a precious naval base in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor stretches out like an eagle's talons to the interior of Hawaii. It is located at the lowest point of the plain between the Kalo Mountains and the Waianae Mountains on the south coast of Oahu, adjacent to the only deep water port of Honolulu. It is also one of the largest and best safe anchoring ports in the North Pacific Islands. The factual basis is that it is now one of the most important ports in the United States and the Pacific. Of course, even if Austria only develops pearls, it can still make money. At this time, the decline in pearl mining on Hawaii Island is actually related to the epidemic of plague on the island. However, these germs can only infect local indigenous people and have little impact on Westerners and Easterners. Franz can use Nanming's laborers to mine pearls, which can be regarded as finding another way for them to get rich. In addition, the mining efficiency of Nanming workers is much higher than that of indigenous people. They are also easier to train, and will not remove pearls too roughly, resulting in a decrease in quality. In addition to mining, Austria also has artificial breeding technology, which can also increase production. Moreover, Hawaiian pearls are of good quality and highly recognized by the market. They are not difficult to sell goods as unscrupulous merchants say. At the same time, Franz also has enough funds to eat the goods and ensure that they are sold at their due value. The first customs director general was still given to Thomas van Uyl. After all, what matters is not who does it, but which country the position belongs to. After leaving the palace, Friedrich led his troops to find the indigenous family, but the other party did not seem to intend to communicate, and shot an accompanying officer with a bow and arrow. Friedrich was not the kind of character who would not fight back or retaliate. He immediately ordered a counterattack, and the bloody battle lasted all day and night. The fighting power of the Polynesians was not overwhelming. They killed and injured a total of 20 Austrian soldiers. This made Friedrich very angry. You must know that the ones he brought were all the best of the best, but they were actually killed by a group of indigenous people. So many were killed and wounded. Fortunately, the two adjutants dissuaded the Archduke in time from escalating the incident further, but this also forced Friedrich to consider the horror of jungle warfare. He had always been lucky enough to think that the British on Kalimantan were trash and that they were completely wiped out due to negligence. Franz's speculation about jungle warfare was nothing more than alarmist point, but after calming down, Friedrich began to think about the matter again, but soon he came to another conclusion. Since jungle combat is so scary, wouldn't it be better to be the ambush party yourself? Chapter 622. A few things about Hungary. On October 2, 1845, the first half of the Great Illyrian Line was officially opened to traffic. This means that from Trieste to Zagreb it will officially join Lusitania, and Croatia will be directly under Austrian rule. Among them, the Hungarians suffered the greatest losses, because they had one less hole to suck blood from the Austrian Empire, and at the same time they could no longer continue to squeeze the Croatians. But to be honest, although Franz had been mentally prepared for the poverty in Croatia, he was still frightened. The entire kingdom contributed less tax revenue than a single city on the coast, less than 5 million florins, less than 1/20th of Bohemia at this time. Bohemia is now the largest economic province in Austria, followed by Venice, Vienna, and California, Mexico, and Chandler with the highest overseas contribution rates. Although Austria now has the ability to directly collect taxes, it still needs to respect tradition and Hungary, and send the tax to Pressburg first, and then transfer it to Vienna by the Hungarian government. However, the amount will naturally not be the full amount. After all, the Hungarians also withheld most of it when taxing, and these originally disappeared taxes were directly used for local construction and development subsidies. The senior officials in Vienna felt that instead of handing over money to the Hungarians, it would be better to consolidate the benefits of the border. After all, everyone had clearly seen the face of the Hungarians, and would not do such useless work again. On the other hand, it was also because the Austrian Empire was stronger and more confident that it dared to say no to Hungary. In fact, Hungary has made a lot of efforts, and they have done everything they can to prevent the construction of the Great Illyrian Railway. First, they colluded with local gentry and incited the people, claiming that the railway would cause earthquakes, make animals crazy, and even trees would no longer be able to grow. These words were also said when Austria was building railways, so the officials responsible for the construction were very experienced. In addition, these words can only deceive people who have never seen the world, and Croatia is Austria's traditional military source area. Many people have joined the army, and many of them have not only seen railways, but also ridden in trains, and fought in wars. They know what a magical thing trains are, and what they can bring to their hometowns. Nothing is more convincing than seeing it with your own eyes. In addition, even if these soldiers are retired, they are still the most vocal people in the local area, so ordinary people naturally cannot think of any resistance. As for the squires, who took the lead in causing trouble, many of them were Hungarians. This group of people usually relied on their special status to bully men and women in the fish and meat village, causing complaints. They were able to coerce the people solely by relying on the power they accumulated in their daily lives, but this thing doesn't work well in front of the imperial power, the army, and the church. The church and soldiers build roads under the banner of the royal family. It's ridiculous that these Hungarian squires talk about tradition. The people who were already holding back their anger were naturally busy adding insult to injury when they saw that the squire was going to lose. They wished they could let the train hit all the Hungarian nobles to death. Now, if you can't do it in the light, you can only play in the dark. Since the Croatian region is mountainous and mostly made of stone structures, it is easy to cause large-scale landslides once blasting is carried out. Some Hungarian leaders hired some desperados and fanatics to directly destroy. However, the power of gunpowder in this era was limited, and a large amount of black powder was needed to cause enough damage. The team carrying barrels of black powder was very conspicuous, so most of them were intercepted easily. Even if someone was brought in batches later, it would be difficult to cause damage. Not to mention the fact that Croatians are xenophobic, and a group of outsiders entering the mountains inexplicably is already suspicious, coupled with the propaganda of the church and local Croatian nobles. Many hunters who retired from the hunting camp immediately captured them as prey point. Moreover, blasting is also very particular. It needs to be buried at a certain depth in a specific location, and most of the desperados who are desperate for money obviously do not have this skill point. In the end, the Hungarian parliament could only frame the Croats for $1 billion, and prepared to directly control Zagreb to eliminate the pro-imperial faction and force the royal faction to take power. It's just that the Hungarian army was driven back as soon as it entered Croatia. In fact, Franz knew that the former would not settle down, so he sent Albrecht to Croatia in advance. The Hungarian generals were extremely familiar with the royal prince, and some had even fought with his subordinates in previous battles. No matter how confident these people are, they would not dare to directly attack the army led by the royal family. After all, they are nominally here to counter rebellion for the empire, not the rebel side. So the two sides simply had a conversation, exchanged information, and then retreated. However, the Hungarian side's subsequent explanation for the unauthorized deployment of troops to conduct large-scale military operations obviously did not satisfy Vienna. However, Austria has too many things to deal with in the past 2 years, and has no time to fight with this traditional ally. In fact, both parties knew that the final result of this matter could only be nothing, so Vienna and Budapest also had a tacit understanding. It's just that these things shocked Kossuth, and he doubted that the Great Hunnic Empire would be able to restore its former glory. But on the other hand, Kossuth has been raised to a level that does not belong to him. He was once a small lawyer, now a national leader, and a future head of state. Any man who has tried the taste called power will inevitably become addicted to it, and Kossuth is naturally no exception, so he quickly got out of his depressed mood. Compatriots, the evil Austrians are taking away our legal rights and our property is being shamelessly violated. Give me freedom, or give me death. Give me freedom or give me death. The young people in the audience were excited. They all believed that Austria had caused the poverty of the Hungarians. As long as they could overthrow the rule of the Habsburg family and get back their rights, they would surely be able to live a good life that everyone would envy. Kossuth on the stage listened to the shouts of the crowd, and he seemed to hear people shouting his name. The warm atmosphere made him feel as if he was in heaven, and intoxicated. Count Zacherny could only close the windows tightly and draw the curtains. Crazy. They are all crazy. Can't they see that the times are progressing? Can't they see how the Austrians beat France? Do they really think that resurrecting the Hungarian Empire can make people live a good life? Count Zacherny knocked on the table so hard that the cups on the table bounced. The foolish people are so arrogant and stupid, but it's not bad. When they are all dead, Hungary will be ours. After all, the emperor always needs someone to manage this land. Prince Esterhazy poured a glass for himself and another for Count Zacherny. Among the Hungarian loyalists, they were the first to choose to be loyal to the royal family and the most powerful. Come on, cheers to our future, Count. Zacherny took the cup and looked at the other person drinking it down in one gulp and couldn't help but sneer in his heart. Those lunatics are all dead. Do you still want to follow in their footsteps? Chapter 623 Colonists. The trade transfer station was Franz's short-term plan for the Hawaiian Islands. He firmly believed that the value and importance of the islands would become apparent over time. After all, transcontinental ocean trade will become more and more frequent in the future. At this time, there were three pillar industries in Hawaii: sandalwood export, whaling industry and pearl gathering industry. Although Franz was not optimistic about the prospects of these industries, money should be made. Franz set his sights on the sandalwood industry and pearl collecting industry because these two businesses did not require high costs and had huge returns. As for the whaling industry, there is not even a single whaling ship in Austria, and there is a lack of relevant technical personnel and technological reserves in addition. In terms of sustainable development, whaling is too fragile compared to the other two luxury goods industries, and the petrochemical and rubber industries that the empire will rely on in the future will replace its role. Both whale baleen and whale oil will be replaced by cheaper industrial products. This is an irreversible trend. And this process will not take too long. Oil in North Africa has been successfully exploited, and rubber in Southeast Asia has also matured. A large amount of cheap raw materials will greatly promote the development of these two industries, and will affect the development of history to a certain extent. Although not as obvious as the electric revolution, it is not far behind. Of course, in addition to the above, Franz also set his sights on the cultivation of coffee and sugar cane. After all, this can not only prevent the surplus of labor, but also occupy some land. It can be said that it kills two birds with one stone. It's just that Friedrich's progress was not going too smoothly at this time. His previous conflicts with the treacherous natives and his subsequent crazy revenge on the attackers were all seen by their local counterparts in the past few days. There have been incidents of indigenous residents attacking Austrian soldiers who landed ashore. When the kingdom of Hawaii was invaded before, they would let it go because they did not harm the interests of other tribes, but now Friedrich's behavior seemed more like a provocation and declaration of war to the other party, so these tribes united and prepared to drive the great powers out of their homes. Perhaps the previous colonists were not large, and they were mainly seeking wealth and enclosing land, so there were not many conflicts with the indigenous people, so the latter did not know the terror of the great powers. This was the first time that Friedrich encountered such an outrageous thing. He found Kamehameha III, who was still secretly delighted that his subjects were so brave. The monarch also pretended to be dumbfounded when questioned by distinguished visitors, and several British, French and American advisors even had the mentality of watching a good show. The Austrian army was too powerful at this time compared to other powers, so they all wanted to see it, and its commander weakened. They never expected that Friedrich would take a preemptive strike and directly order the elimination of creatures that might pose a threat to his soldiers. After receiving no reply. No matter how powerful the indigenous people are, it is impossible to fight against the well-prepared modern army. Under the baptism of naval guns and rockets, their defenses are ineffective and full of loopholes, and bows and arrows are even less likely to fight against firearms. Soon the indigenous tribes near Pearl Bay were wiped out, and they could only hide in the jungle on the island to avoid threats. However, the local Nanming workers who had long been oppressed by the indigenous people stood up and joined the Austrian army under the leadership of some spies. These people are better at jungle warfare than Friedrich's Marines. After all, they relied on this to defeat the arrogant British on Kalimantan. In the end, it took nearly a month for the Austrian army to completely eliminate the hostile forces near Pearl Bay. This has worsened the situation in Hawaii, which is already suffering from a sharp decline in infectious diseases. These Chinese naturally became the new owners of the Pearl Bay area. Only a small number of local managers were left behind, but this was enough for any local force to no longer dare to underestimate its strength. It turns out that I'm really just an ant, Kamehameha III said with a bitter smile. At this time, he was shrouded in fear like thousands of indigenous people on the island. Historically, due to this monarch's strategy of allocating land, his subjects became real landowners. Before World War I, they all frantically enslaved laborers from the East. Moreover, they are more vicious than Westerners, often increasing rents at will, beating and scolding at will, and even committing violence and robbing property. Originally, according to the plan, Friedrich needed to use funds to purchase land, or at least joint development was an acceptable option, but in the end it turned into robbery. However, this kind of change had been within Franz's expectation, so he prepared a group of Chinese laborers in advance. After all, it was not realistic in the short term to develop Hawaiian Island by transporting people from the distant empire. Miss Kagura, why don't you come and take a look? Those fireworks are so beautiful, princess. Sneaker looked at the smoke and the burning gunpowder in fascination, and the huge explosions were like sweet music. Kagura looked at the unequal battle in the distance with some indifference. She had seen far more intense battles than this, and she was also present in the naval battle that destroyed the Oman Empire Navy. Your Highness Princess, you'd better go into the cabin and rest. It's windy outside. Kagura deliberately brought out a cloak because she knew that the former would not follow her advice. Miss Kagura, you are so considerate. I heard that you are Franz's valet. Sneaker asked tentatively. Kagura was no longer the hateful little girl she was before. She knew what the former wanted to know, but nothing happened. Reporting. To your highness princess, I'm just a student of the Grand Duke. Student? This statement was unexpected to Princess Sneaker. She wanted to know what the Saint Friedrich said was like. Although Sneaker had contact with Franz, the time was too short and too considerate for the former to judge the latter's character and preferences. Carolina is a complete idiot. She only thinks Franz is handsome and strong. From the servants, we learned that Franz was very knowledgeable and good at wrestling, but rarely attended royal events. In fact, the royal family of this generation rarely show their faces in public, and their exposure rate is far less than that of the Holy Roman Empire. At that time, Archduke John attended various celebrity balls and banquets every day. He would also attend music festivals, opera openings, and even go to pubs and coffee shops to chat with people. Archduke Karol often rode with the army on expeditions, and the late Emperor Francis II often overlooked his subjects from the balcony. This generation of Emperor Ferdinand I cannot be said to be weak-minded. His younger brother, Archduke Franz Karol, was a social terror. The only 2 times he appeared in public in so many years were once in a debate with someone in a park and once drunkenly in a fountain in a square. Take a bath inside. In Archduke Karl's family, the eldest went to Switzerland for a trip. The eldest hid in the headquarters all day long and didn't know what he was researching, and the second went to the United States to dig coal. I really don't understand the royal family's hobbies. The third child drifted on the sea all day, and the fourth child simply stayed in his palace and never came out. Not to mention the younger archdukes in his direct line. Only Archduke Franz would occasionally ride out in a carriage to go to the Royal Society of Science. Chapter 624 Attacked. The seaside of Hawaii has azure waters, white sandy beaches, dense forests and bright flowers. You can also see brightly colored fish through the clear water, and there are sea turtles lazily basking in the sun on the shore. It's just that the black warship anchored not far away seems incompatible with this beautiful natural picture. The term student obviously does not satisfy Princess Sneaker, but this does not prevent her from continuing to seek the answers she wants. Then, what did he teach you? Sneaker asked with interest. A reason to live. Kagura said it lightly, but it made the former's pupils tremble, and he looked at this alien like a monster. In fact, Princess Sneaker can be regarded as an alien in the Oman Empire. She is different from the ladies, who are waiting for marriage. She likes to travel on camels, likes knives, likes muskets, likes dancing and reading, and even more knowledgeable than many ulama. Ulema, a scholar in the Xianfang religious tradition. But the Japanese woman in front of me is really weird, but her owner may be even weirder. Living is a matter of course in Sneaker's eyes, so she cannot understand what the other party said. This is because of the differences in history and religion between the East and the West. In the East, there are often sayings about killing one's life to achieve benevolence and martyrdom, while the West usually opposes this practice, and the same is true for Xianfang sect. So Princess Sneaker changed the topic. Then, what skills did he teach you? Kagura took out a pistol directly from his arms. Although Sneaker knew that she could not dodge the bullet, she still dodged instinctively. At this time, gunfire rang out, and a native not far away who had just climbed onto the bow of the boat threw forward, clutching his chest. Then 2 more native warriors were knocked down, but more natives climbed up. Kagura grabbed Princess Sneaker and retreated while fighting. She didn't know how many attackers there were. Although Friedrich took most of them away, the people on the ship should theoretically be enough to cope with the attack. According to her calculations, as long as she persisted for about 5 minutes, the soldiers on the lower deck would arrive. Moreover, the sound of the alarm bell was heard only after the gunshot, so he should be the first one to spot the attacker. The scale of the attack should not be large, at least the sentries were not killed. But another point worried her. Just like Franz said, winning too many battles is sometimes not a good thing. At this time, the Austrian army undoubtedly underestimated the enemy, but another thing was to think more carefully. The attackers actually attacked Friedrich's flagship first, and all important people lived on this floor. How could a group of indigenous people investigate the matter so clearly? Is it just luck? That's absolutely impossible. The only reasonable explanation is that there is a traitor in this fleet. Historically, metal fixed loading ammunition only began to be accepted by various countries and installed on a large scale after 1870. However, this technology has actually been available since 1812. After several improvements by the Royal Society of Science in Vienna, it can be fully used in actual combat. The revolver in Kagura's hand at this time was a new weapon used with metal fixed ammunition. Theoretically speaking, although more than a dozen indigenous people did not get on the boat together, they still had to pinch two women who were less than 20 meters away. However, both the shooting speed and the reloading speed of this new revolver are beyond the imagination of ordinary people in this era. After Kagura emptied the bullets of the two revolvers, finally a native couldn't bear the fear of death and subconsciously threw the spear the former ducked sideways and calmly poured out the shells, then replaced it with a brand new drum. After the gun was reset, a bullet accurately hit the latter's chest. In fact, unless it is to show off skills, or the opponent is wearing thick armor, few people choose to shoot the head. After all, the target of the head is much smaller than the torso. Just like that, Kagura hid in the cabin. At this time, only 4 of the 15 attackers were left. They never expected that this would be the result. They thought it would be as easy as an eagle catching a rabbit, but before they could catch them, they were almost wiped out. Although the door in front of me was made of wood, it was made of fine oak and fixed with steel plates, making it impossible for the axes in the hands of these natives to break open. Not far away, there was the thumping sound and yelling of soldiers stepping on the deck. Although they could not understand it, they were nothing more than telling themselves to stop and kill themselves at this time. The strong man leading the way couldn't do much, so he directly chose to hit the door with his body. However, this trick is actually much easier to use than an axe. After all, no matter how strong the door is, the folding leaves are just like that. After the door was knocked open, there were no bullets coming towards him. In fact, Kagura was hiding on the side at this time because she didn't know how many more enemies there were, and there was also the burden of Princess Shanika. The latter considered herself to be a very brave person and also had good shooting skills, but when she was suddenly assassinated, she realized how weak she was. An indigenous probe wanted to observe the situation inside the house, but was directly hit by a bullet in the face and fell to the ground twitching. Another native was so frightened that he quickly retreated, but the strong native leader before did not allow him to do so. The second native was also hit by a shot as soon as he showed his head, but he did not fall down because the strong native behind was holding on to the former's belt. Just like that, the indigenous man who was shot was carried forward, his eyes full of despair, and his mouth was saying something in native language. But that didn't matter to Kagura because she had already heard the sounds outside and the vibrations on the deck, and a large group of soldiers would arrive here in less than 2 minutes. Kagura took a deep breath, and then she finally saw clearly the native who was using his companion as a shield, and the 2 revolvers in his hands fired together. It's just that the caliber of the pistol she used is too small. After shooting through the human shield in front, it won't have much effect on the second person. At this time, a small man suddenly appeared from behind the strong man. His movements were as agile as a spiritual ape, but no matter how fast he was, he could not move faster than a bullet. But before he died, the little man still threw a stone rope in the direction of Kagura. When the latter was dodging, the strong man just now took the opportunity to rush up with the body on his head. At this time, Kagura's bullets were empty. She decisively dropped her gun and rushed towards the opponent. The strong native dropped the corpse in his hand and stretched out his hand to catch Kagura, who was rushing towards him, but was directly grabbed by the latter and slapped him. Beitao means that in a judo sparring, the opponent breaks forward, bends your body and slides forward and downward. At the same time, you bend your knee with one foot and kick the opponent's abdomen with your foot, causing the opponent to roll over your neck like a roller. Down. To put it simply, it is to directly use the sacrificial skill to throw the opponent who is charging forward with yourself as the fulcrum point. The power of this move has little to do with the caster's own strength. It mainly depends on the opponent's forward speed and weight. The strong native happened to have two characteristics: fast forward speed and large weight. Coupled with the furniture displayed beside him, the damage he suffered was naturally great. Chapter 625 A Wise Plan. Friedrich was naturally furious when he learned that his hometown had been stolen. You must know that not only was his fiancé on board, but also the important personnel Franz had entrusted to escort. He did not want to deal with those Japanese pointits. Just that when Friedrich returned to his flagship Prince Eugen, he was a little dumbfounded. That is, the little one actually killed 13 people and captured a very strong native pointits. Just that the native hasn't woken up yet. After all, he fell on a hard wooden board, not a soft rubber mat. If it were a concrete floor, he would be dead. After all, he has fully consumed almost all damage increasing buffs. Princess Sneaker was unharmed, but she looked a little haggard and a little shaken. Friedrich took off his cloak to her and then told his men to take her to rest first. After Princess Sneaker left, Friedrich became furious because he couldn't believe that a dozen natives could storm his flagship and reach the captain's room. A total of 2 crew members were killed. One was the sentry and the other was the boiler chief. Neither of them had any weapons or offered any resistance. If it's not that the other party knows witchcraft, then there might be a mole on the ship. Friedrich and Kagura had the same judgment, and there were not many suspects because there were only a few insiders with this power: the deputy captain Jifuru, the captain of the sentry on duty, and the ship's doctor were in charge of staying behind. When the incident occurred, the deputy captain Jifuru had been huddled in the cabinet in his cabin and did not dare to come out. First of all, it can be ruled out that the captain of the sentry was too hungry, always going to the toilet at the bow of the boat. Only the ship's doctor from Baton was the most suspicious because he was the one who called the sentries to the infirmary to wait for a physical examination and then went out for about 10 minutes without being seen. The ship's doctor claimed that he went to the toilet, but the captain of the sentry who had been at the bow said that he had not seen the former. Who sent you? Friedrich was really a little angry. He didn't expect that someone would dare to do such a thing under his eyes. Grand Duke, please believe me, I have not done anything to harm the Austrian Empire. However, before he could finish his words, Vice Captain Jifuru punched him and broke the bridge of his nose. Arsehole, you damn guy obviously has such a high salary. Why are you dissatisfied? The ship's doctor's salary is as high as 3,000 florins, which is higher than the salary of his deputy captain and rear admiral. The ship's doctor continued to remain silent, and several of Friedrich's officers remained unmoved, even after being punched and kicked. Some even pulled out their pistols, but it still had no effect. Master, professional matters should be left to professionals, Kagura suggested, and Friedrich immediately understood. He remembered the group of priests sent by Franz. It was said that they had been to Asia and were quite good at interrogations and other things. Friedrich ordered the ship's doctor to be handed over to the group of magicians for interrogation, and soon he got the answer he wanted. The French were the ones responsible. The French consul spent 500 francs to buy the deafened map from the ship's doctor and bribed the latter to help remove the guards. After the truth came to light, Friedrich announced the ship's doctor's crime in front of the entire army and then hanged him in this picturesque place. As for the French consul, he left it to the professionals. The priests sent by Franz were specially used to deal with the aftermath. After all, to fundamentally disintegrate the Hawaiian kingdom, it was necessary to destroy its ruling foundation. In fact, the indigenous people may not really hate the Austrians and the Chinese who steal jobs with them, but the indigenous people have no say and can only be brainwashed by the nobles and landlords. The mission of these priests is to do the opposite and reverse brainwash the indigenous people, making them think that Austria is here to save them, and that the local nobles and landowners are the devils who control and fool them. In addition to delivering eggs and telling stories, the priests would also invite the natives to work on farms in Austria. The amount of money they made depends entirely on how many tasks they completed. After all, nothing in this world is more convincing than personal experience, and soon the natives clearly recognized the faces of the chiefs. In fact, Austria has an advantage that the indigenous chiefs do not have, that is, due to trade with Nanming. Franz can get cheap food and find an excellent market for goods on Hawaii Island. At the same time, many of these priests have knowledge about agriculture and technology, and with the help of science and technology, they can create far more harvests than primitive agriculture. However, in the eyes of the local indigenous people, these are completely realistic manifestations of miracles. The lush crops and abundant fruits are God's response to them. In a sense, this was a two-way street. This virtuous cycle soon affected the entire Hawaiian Islands, and even the indigenous people took the initiative to ask for cooperation with the Austrian Empire. In addition to growing sugar and coffee, Franz also planned the scientific and sustainable development of the Hawaiian Islands, such as the mining and planting of sandalwood. Historically, it was due to the indiscriminate deforestation of Hawaiians that later generations could not find sandalwood in Honolulu. This has to be said to be a very ironic thing, and many people who come here will find this problem. Then there is the mining and cultivation of pearls. These may be too early for the indigenous people, but at least they must understand that they cannot exhaust their efforts. In fact, the most attractive condition of the church for the local indigenous people was to treat their diseases. The medical conditions in Hawaii at that time were in a mess. Compared with the witchcraft of these indigenous people, bloodletting, mercury injection and amputation seemed less terrible. The local native religion, the Kapua Church, buries people alive to absorb the essence of the earth. But in fact, many patients are often suffocated to death because they are buried too deeply, because they cannot breathe. Of course, some were drowned alive because the tide was too late to dig them out, and some were even bitten to death by sea snakes in the sand. At this time, the Austrian church could be described as integrating Chinese and Western medicine. They could not only use the four diagnostic methods of herbal medicine to combine medicine with ginseng, but they could also directly give people sequinine and allicin. In fact, because pharmacology could not keep up with the development of medicine at that time, these magicians often tried their luck with allicin, quinine and wicker juice, aspirin, after finding that conventional treatments were ineffective. But generally speaking, Austrian medicine has made great progress due to Franz's intervention. It's just that Franz in Vienna rarely had the opportunity to share his achievements and joy with others. What he did was a bit too high level for his friends. The family members are more concerned about their physical and psychological problems. After all, Franz always looks thoughtful, like a melancholy middle-aged man. Jenny and Talia were relatively clear about what Franz was doing, but the clearer they became, the more awed they became. As for Mrs. Sophie, under the influence of the Archbishop, she completely felt that she had given birth to a saint, and she preferred praying to teaching Franz. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.